Civilizations rarely disappear in a single moment. They fade piece by piece, first the people, then the language, then the stories explaining what they left behind. Eventually, only the structures remain. Across the ancient world, enormous platforms overlook empty valleys, passages run deep beneath ruined cities, and monuments still follow patterns established thousands of years ago. We can walk through these places, measure their walls, and trace the marks left by their builders, but we can never see them through the eyes of those who created them. That missing perspective is where the mystery begins. Each surviving structure offers a glimpse into a world we can almost understand, while keeping its most fascinating details just beyond our reach. Today, we journey into those forgotten places and explore the questions the ancient world left unfinished. Baalbek, in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, preserves an ancient construction site where Roman builders successfully moved stones weighing hundreds of tons, then began cutting even larger monoliths and left them permanently trapped in the quarry. The quarry lies roughly 800 meters southwest of the monumental sanctuary of Baalbek and has been known for centuries because of the enormous block called Hajar al-Hibla, or the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. Archaeological work by the German Archaeological Institute and Lebanese researchers later exposed an even larger monolith beneath it, transforming the quarry from a famous curiosity into direct evidence of an unfinished building operation. Measurements indicate that Hajar al-Hibla is approximately 21 meters long and may weigh close to 1,000 tons, while another exposed block has been estimated at about 1,240 tons. The largest known block in the quarry is approximately 19.5 meters long, 6 meters wide, and at least 5.5 meters thick, giving it an estimated mass of roughly 1,650 tons. It remains attached to the limestone bedrock. These numbers matter because Baalbek was not a place where ancient engineers merely imagined moving enormous stones. They actually did it. In the podium associated with the Temple of Jupiter are 3 famous blocks, collectively known as the Trilithon. Each is approximately 19 meters long, more than 4 meters high, and around 3.5 meters deep, with commonly cited mass estimates near 800 tons. They were quarried, transported from the same general quarry zone, and positioned several meters above the surrounding ground. Whatever machinery and organization were involved, the completed masonry proves that Baalbek's builders had already solved a transport problem that would have been extraordinary even by Roman imperial standards. That makes the unfinished stones in the quarry far more puzzling, because instead of remaining safely within a proven weight range, the builders appear to have prepared blocks that push dramatically beyond it. The largest unfinished monolith may have exceeded the mass of a trilithon block by roughly a factor of 2. That raises the central question: why would experienced engineers deliberately increase the size of their stones when transportation was already one of the most difficult parts of the project? Cutting a monolith of this scale was not a casual experiment. Thousands of cubic feet of limestone had to be isolated by excavating channels around its sides, its dimensions controlled as the quarrymen worked deeper into the bedrock, and an enormous amount of material removed before transportation could even begin. The block was therefore the product of substantial planning and labor. If the builders already understood the difficulty of moving 800-ton stones, they must have had some reason to believe that something approaching twice that mass was worth preparing. One possibility is that the quarry itself helped them overcome part of the problem. It stood at a higher elevation than the sanctuary, allowing engineers to exploit a descending route rather than lifting the stones through the entire difference in height. Researchers have proposed combinations of prepared roads, wooden structures, rollers or sledges, capstans and pulley systems. Experimental engineering calculations have shown that large teams operating multiple capstans could theoretically generate the force required to move extremely heavy masonry. Yet a mechanically possible reconstruction is not proof of the exact Roman method, and no surviving ancient description explains how Baalbek's largest blocks were transported. More importantly, methods capable of moving roughly 800 tons do not automatically scale safely to 1600. Friction increases, ropes and wooden components approach their working limits, road surfaces experience far greater pressure, and controlling a moving mass on a slope becomes increasingly dangerous. Doubling the mass could therefore create problems far beyond simply doubling the number of workers. The unfinished stones may preserve the point where this scaling strategy failed, but even that interpretation remains uncertain. Hajar al-Hibla contains imperfections that could have made transportation unsafe, suggesting quarrymen may have abandoned it after recognizing weaknesses in the limestone. The largest block discovered beneath it introduces a different problem because it remains partly embedded in the quarry floor, making it difficult to determine whether workers abandoned it because of geological defects, because calculations changed, or because the architectural program itself was altered before extraction was complete. If structural weakness alone caused the abandonment of one stone, that does not explain why several exceptionally large blocks remained unused in the same quarry. The pattern suggests that the interruption may have affected more than a single defective monolith. Evidence from the sanctuary strengthens that possibility. The Temple of Jupiter complex developed through several construction phases, and the gigantic masonry usually associated with the trilithon formed part of a monumental podium whose history is more complicated than a single continuous building campaign. Some enormous blocks reached their intended positions while other masonry surfaces remained incompletely dressed, and blocks apparently prepared for further work never left the quarry. Construction at Baalbek itself did not simply end. The sanctuary continued to change under Roman rule. Instead, something more specific appears to have happened. The particular architectural strategy involving the most extreme monoliths seems to have stopped. That distinction changes the mystery. Political disruption, changes in imperial financing, alterations to the temple design, shortages of specialized labor or new engineering decisions could all have made the largest stones unnecessary. Yet none of these explanations has been demonstrated as the single cause. There is also no surviving plan showing exactly where the unfinished blocks were supposed to be installed. Without that information, archaeologists cannot determine whether the 1,600-ton monolith represented the next stage of the podium, another retaining structure, or a plan that was abandoned before the stone was fully detached. Its intended destination has disappeared from the archaeological record, leaving only the component itself. The progression in size is therefore more revealing than the unfinished stones considered individually. Baalbek's builders first demonstrated that monoliths approaching 800 tons could be transported and positioned. Quarry operations then produced stones approaching 1,000 tons, more than 1,200 tons, and ultimately an estimated 1,650 tons. This looks less like an inability to handle megalithic construction and more like an attempt to push an already successful system toward increasingly extreme limits. Somewhere during that progression, however, the sequence broke. The largest stones were never transported, even though considerable work had already been invested in shaping them. There is a practical reason this may have happened. Ancient quarrying allowed engineers to estimate dimensions and volume before a block was completely freed. But the true difficulty of extraction depended on factors that became clearer only as work advanced: hidden fractures, variations in limestone quality, the condition of the underside, the geometry required to detach the block, and the actual load that transport equipment would have to control. A project could therefore reach an advanced stage before engineers concluded that the risk had become unacceptable. Yet if that was the explanation at Baalbek, it produced an extraordinary archaeological consequence. The quarry became a frozen record of an engineering decision, preserving stones at different stages between bedrock and architecture. This is why the unfinished quarry is more difficult to explain than the completed trilithon. The 3 installed stones prove capability. The abandoned stones reveal uncertainty. The builders were not confronting 800-ton masonry for the first time. They had experience with it, and nevertheless attempted something substantially larger. Either they possessed a transport strategy, intended to handle masses approaching 1,600 tons, and never had the opportunity to use it, or the quarry records the moment when their ambition finally exceeded what their construction system could reliably achieve. Archaeology cannot yet distinguish between those possibilities. In the highlands of central Turkey, near the village of Fasilar in Konya province, an enormous Hittite monument lies on its back as if its builders simply walked away. Carved from a single block of stone more than 8 meters long and weighing roughly 70 tons, it was shaped for a destination it apparently never reached. The monument was brought to scholarly attention in the 19th century as explorers began documenting Hittite remains across Anatolia. Its unfinished surfaces immediately distinguished it from monuments already erected at temples and sanctuaries. Measuring approximately 8.3 meters long, 2.75 meters wide, and 2.25 meters thick, the Fasilar monument is generally dated to the 13th century BCE, during the final centuries of the Hittite Empire. Its relief depicts a large storm god above a mountain deity, accompanied by lions, but portions of the stone remain only roughly worked, preserving evidence of a production process that stopped before completion. That unfinished state creates the central problem. The monument appears to have been carved close to the source of its stone, rather than at the place where it was ultimately intended to stand. This was practical. Removing unnecessary material at the quarry reduced the mass that workers would later have to transport, while delicate finishing could be postponed until the block had survived the journey. Yet Fasilar seems to have stopped precisely between those stages. Enough work had been completed for its religious composition to become recognizable, but the enormous block was never fully finished, erected, or apparently carried to its final destination. The question is therefore not simply why a carving was abandoned. It is why the Hittites invested so much labor in preparing a roughly 70-ton monument and then stopped immediately before one of the most demanding stages of the entire operation. The scale makes that decision difficult to dismiss as routine. Moving 70 tons of stone through the Anatolian landscape required far more than attaching ropes and gathering workers. Even on prepared ground, the load would have demanded a coordinated system of sledges, timber, ropes, hauling teams, and carefully controlled routes. Every slope increased the forces acting on the transport system, while soft ground could immobilize the load by concentrating tens of thousands of kilograms onto a relatively small contact area. The Hittites were capable engineers who transported large stone blocks for monumental gates, fortifications, temples, and sculptural programs, so the existence of a difficult transport problem alone cannot explain Fasilar. Whoever commissioned it must have understood from the beginning that the finished object would be extraordinarily heavy. The 70-ton mass was not an unexpected problem discovered after carving, it was inherent in the design. This makes the sequence of work especially revealing. If the monument had been rejected because the stone fractured catastrophically, archaeologists might expect an obvious structural failure capable of explaining the abandonment. If the sculptors had made an irreparable mistake, the defect might similarly be visible. Instead, The surviving monument looks more like a project interrupted while moving through a planned sequence of production. Large areas remain rough, while the principal figures are already recognizable, exactly what might be expected if detailed finishing was supposed to occur after transportation. The unfinished surfaces therefore preserve something finished monuments normally erase, evidence of how monumental Hittite sculpture may have moved from quarry to installation. But where was that installation supposed to be? One of the most intriguing proposals connects Fasilah with Eflatun Pınar, a Hittite spring sanctuary near Lake Bayshehir. The sanctuary contains a monumental stone facade composed of divine figures arranged around sacred water, and similarities in religious imagery have encouraged researchers to investigate whether Fasilah belonged to the same monumental landscape. Digital documentation and close-range photogrammetry have even allowed researchers to examine its geometry in 3 dimensions and reconsider how such a huge block might have been positioned. Yet no surviving inscription on Fasilah identifies its intended destination. Without that evidence, Eflatun Pınar remains an important hypothesis rather than a demonstrated endpoint. That uncertainty transforms the abandoned stone into a logistical puzzle. If another sanctuary was its destination, a route had to exist before carving began. Engineers would need to know whether the block could pass through the terrain, how steep the gradients were, where pulling teams could operate, and how the monument would finally be raised. A stone approximately 8 meters long could not simply be redirected whenever an obstacle appeared. Its movement would have been a planned operation, involving manpower, animals, timber, road preparation, and probably administrative support from authorities capable of mobilizing substantial resources. If transportation proved impossible only after most of the preliminary carving had been completed, then the project represents an extraordinary planning failure. If transportation was feasible, something else must have stopped the operation before it began. The date of the monument makes that second possibility particularly important. Fasilah is generally assigned to the 13th century BCE, placing its creation close to the final phase of Hittite imperial power. During this period, the Hittite state controlled large territories from its capital at Hattusa, but the political system was under increasing pressure. By around 1200 BCE, Hattusa had ceased functioning as the center of the empire, and the centralized Hittite political structure fragmented during the wider disruptions associated with the Late Bronze Age collapse. Drought, food shortages, shifting trade networks, internal political tensions, warfare, and regional instability have all been investigated as parts of this broader transformation, although no single explanation accounts for every region or event. Fasilah therefore raises a possibility that cannot yet be proven. The monument may preserve the physical interruption of a state-sponsored project during a period when the political system supporting such projects was changing or disappearing. Monumental construction depends on more than sculptors. It requires administrators to organize labor, officials to supply food and equipment, specialists to prepare transport, and political authorities willing to continue spending resources on a monument that may take years to complete. If the patron died, a royal program changed, territorial control shifted, or resources were suddenly redirected toward more urgent problems, an enormous block already partly carved could become useless almost overnight. 70 tons of stone cannot easily be repurposed, moved aside, or returned to the quarry. The simplest response may have been to leave it exactly where work had stopped. Yet the chronology is not precise enough to turn that scenario into fact. Scholars have associated the monument with different moments within the later Hittite period, and without an inscription naming the ruler who commissioned it, its political context remains uncertain. That missing name matters. If the patron could be identified securely, the abandonment might be compared with a specific succession crisis, military campaign, religious program, or territorial reorganization. Instead, the monument survives without the document that could explain why hundreds or thousands of hours of quarrying and carving suddenly ceased. There is another possibility hidden in its unfinished surfaces. Perhaps Fasilla was not abandoned because the builders discovered that it could not be moved. Perhaps it was waiting to be moved when the order simply never came. This distinction is crucial. A failed transportation attempt might leave evidence of preparation, damage, or movement around the block. A cancelled project could leave exactly what survives now, a massive object prepared to an intermediate stage and then frozen there. In that sense, the absence of completion becomes archaeological evidence in its own right. The monument was clearly intended to communicate power. Its divine hierarchy, lion's enormous scale, and monolithic construction would have created an imposing image once raised vertically. This was not an experimental carving produced casually beside a quarry. Someone commanded substantial resources to create it, and craftsmen followed that command far enough to transform a huge block of stone into recognizable sacred imagery. Then the process ended before the monument performed the function for which all that work had been undertaken. In the ancient granite quarries of Aswan in southern Egypt, a 42-meter monument remains attached to the bedrock, abandoned before it could ever leave the ground. Known as the unfinished obelisk, it would have weighed roughly 1,100 to 1,200 metric tons if completed, making it substantially larger than any ancient Egyptian obelisk successfully erected. The monument was never truly lost, because its enormous outline remained exposed within the quarry landscape near Aswan, but archaeological investigation transformed it from an abandoned block of granite into one of the clearest surviving records of Egyptian stoneworking. Usually, an obelisk reveals almost nothing about how it was extracted because the quarry disappears from the finished monument. Here, construction stopped before that evidence could vanish. Its upper surface and sides had already been shaped, trenches had been cut around it, and tool marks remained embedded in the granite, while the underside was still connected to the natural rock. The quarry therefore preserves a construction process interrupted at a remarkably informative moment. The conventional explanation for the abandonment appears straightforward. Cracks developed in the granite, making the enormous monolith unsuitable for completion. Yet the cracks create a deeper archaeological problem, because identifying exactly when they formed is far more difficult than simply observing them now. Granite around Aswan contains natural fractures produced by geological stresses long before Egyptian quarrying began, and some weaknesses may have existed inside the rock without being obvious from the original surface. As workers removed material around the obelisk, the distribution of stress through the granite changed. A fracture that had once been insignificant could have widened as surrounding stone disappeared, while repeated pounding during quarrying could also have contributed to the propagation of an existing weakness. The surviving cracks therefore record failure, but they do not provide a simple timestamp for when that failure became fatal to the project. This distinction matters because the obelisk had already required an extraordinary investment of labor. Its projected dimensions indicate that workers were attempting something beyond the scale of most completed Egyptian obelisks. If a major fracture had been clearly visible at the beginning, continuing to excavate such an enormous block would have wasted a vast amount of effort. The fact that quarrying progressed so far suggests either that the dangerous weakness was initially hidden, that it appeared or expanded during extraction, or that the stone was considered usable until the fracture crossed a critical threshold. None of these possibilities can currently be demonstrated with certainty. The abandoned monument captures the final condition of the granite, not the sequence in which every crack developed. That uncertainty becomes even more important when the mechanics of quarrying are considered. Numerous pounding stones made from hard dolerite have been found in the Aswan quarry region, and the marks preserved around the obelisk are consistent with repeated percussion being used to crush and remove granite. Rather than cutting the monument free with a single operation, workers could gradually excavate trenches along its sides while shaping its exposed surface. Experimental work demonstrates that dolerite can damage and remove granite through persistent impact, although doing this across a monument more than 40 meters long would demand enormous quantities of repetitive labor. Thousands upon thousands of blows would slowly deepen the trenches, and every additional centimeter removed would alter the physical relationship between the emerging monolith and the bedrock supporting it. This may be crucial to understanding the cracks. While the obelisk remained part of a continuous granite mass, internal forces were distributed through surrounding stone. As workers isolated its sides, however, the future monument increasingly behaved as a separate body. Its own immense weight would have mattered more as support conditions changed. Granite is extremely strong under compression but far less tolerant of tensile stress, concentrated around existing fractures, a hidden geological discontinuity that posed little danger early in quarrying could therefore become serious later. Whether this process actually caused the decisive fracture cannot be proven, but it explains why the question is not simply whether the Egyptians somehow failed to notice an obvious crack. The surviving quarry surface adds another complication. Not every fracture visible now necessarily belongs to the exact moment when construction stopped. The obelisk has remained exposed for thousands of years, during which thermal expansion, weathering, and other environmental processes have continued acting on the granite. Researchers must distinguish ancient structural weaknesses from later changes, while also determining which ancient fracture was severe enough to make the monument unusable. Without an Egyptian record describing the decision to abandon the project, the stone itself carries almost the entire argument, and stone does not preserve events with the chronological precision of written documentation. The unfinished underside makes the failure even more significant. Workers had not yet completely separated the obelisk from the bedrock, meaning the most difficult stage of extraction was still ahead. They would eventually have needed to remove granite beneath an object whose estimated mass approached 1,200 tons, while preventing the monolith from cracking under its own weight. Exactly how this final separation would have been accomplished at this unprecedented scale remains uncertain, because the operation never happened here. The site shows the preparation for extraction, but stops before revealing the complete procedure. In effect, the construction failure preserved evidence of Egyptian quarrying while simultaneously denying archaeology the final chapter of the technique. Even successful separation would only have created another engineering problem. The finished obelisk would then have needed to leave the quarry, descend toward the Nile, be loaded onto a vessel capable of carrying its enormous mass, travel downstream, and eventually be raised vertically at its intended destination. Egyptian engineers unquestionably transported enormous stone monuments, and surviving obelisks prove that they mastered complex quarrying and transportation systems. Yet the Aswan block represents a different extreme. At roughly 1,200 tons, it would have exceeded the mass of most surviving erected obelisks by a wide margin. Because the project ended before transportation began, there is no direct evidence showing what specific infrastructure had been prepared for this particular stone. Its intended destination is also uncertain. The monument is frequently associated with the reign of Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, a period famous for ambitious obelisk construction, including major monuments erected at Karnak. Hatshepsut's standing obelisk there rises close to 30 meters, and weighs several hundred tons, demonstrating the extraordinary level already achieved by Egyptian quarrymen and engineers. The Aswan project would have pushed those capabilities considerably further. Yet the unfinished stone carries no completed inscription identifying its commissioner or destination, preventing a definitive connection between the quarry and a particular temple project. This absence makes the moment of abandonment especially difficult to reconstruct. The cracks provide the strongest physical explanation, but there is no surviving order stating that quarrying stopped on a particular day because a particular fracture had appeared. It is unknown whether workers noticed a sudden crack during pounding, gradually watched an existing fissure widen, or exposed a hidden defect only after removing enough surrounding granite to reveal it. They may have attempted to assess whether the project could continue before finally deciding that the risk was unacceptable. Whatever happened, abandoning the stone after so much work indicates that the defect was considered serious enough to outweigh the enormous investment already made. That decision also reveals something about the precision demanded by an obelisk. A smaller stone block containing a defect might still be reshaped or reused, but a monumental obelisk depended on structural continuity along its entire length. Once erected, the granite shaft would place tremendous forces through a narrow monolithic body. A serious fracture could turn transportation or raising into catastrophic failure. The workers therefore did not merely need to extract a gigantic piece of granite. They needed to extract one with sufficient integrity to survive every stage that followed. The unfinished obelisk demonstrates how a geological flaw measured against a monument more than 40 meters long could erase years of planning and labor. Segesta Temple in western Sicily, Italy, looks almost complete from a distance, yet after roughly 2,400 years, its stonework still preserves the unmistakable signs of a construction project that was never finished. Built around 430 to 420 BCE on a hill outside the ancient city of Segesta, the monument measures roughly 61 meters long and 26 meters wide, with 36 surviving Doric columns forming an imposing outer colonnade. The builders completed much of the structure that gave the temple its monumental appearance, but stopped before several essential stages of finishing had begun. Why construction ended at precisely this point remains uncertain. The site itself was never truly lost, because the temple remained standing prominently above the surrounding landscape and was described by travelers long before systematic archaeological investigation began. Archaeological study eventually revealed something far more important than its remarkable preservation. Surfaces that initially seemed unusually plain were actually evidence of unfinished work. The columns had never received their characteristic Doric fluting. Projecting pieces of stone used during handling remained on blocks where craftsmen would normally have removed them, and the expected internal sanctuary was apparently never completed. Rather than a finished temple stripped by centuries of damage, Segesta preserved something much rarer, a monumental ancient building frozen between structural construction and final finishing. That timing creates the central problem. The builders had already completed much of the most visually dramatic exterior architecture. The temple was designed as a Doric peripteral structure, with 6 columns across each short side and 14 along each long side, counting the corner columns twice for a total of 36. Massive stone drums had been quarried, transported uphill, positioned and stacked into columns. Capitals had been installed, and the entablature above them had been substantially constructed. This was not a project abandoned after foundations were laid. Considerable quantities of stone had already been extracted and shaped, while teams of quarrymen, haulers, masons and specialized craftsmen had completed enough work for the monument to resemble a finished Greek temple when viewed from a distance. Yet when the project reached the stage where surfaces, details, and internal architecture should have been completed, work appears to have stopped. The smooth columns provide some of the clearest evidence. Mature Doric columns normally carried vertical flutes cut into their shafts, commonly 20 around each column, producing the alternating ridges and grooves that strongly affect the appearance of Greek architecture under sunlight. At Segesta, the shafts remain largely unfluted. This is significant because Greek builders could leave delicate finishing work until the column drums had been erected, reducing the risk that finished edges would be damaged during transportation and assembly. Their absence, therefore, places the interruption relatively late in the construction sequence. The builders did not merely imagine a temple and fail to realize it. They brought enormous stone elements into their final architectural positions and then never completed the surfaces. Even more revealing are small projections deliberately left on some blocks. These temporary bosses or handling projections were useful, while heavy stones were being transported, maneuvered, and positioned. Once construction reached its finishing stages, masons could remove them and dress the surfaces smooth. Their survival at Segesta is effectively archaeological evidence of interrupted workmanship. Similar traces at other ancient construction sites help researchers reconstruct the sequence through which rough quarry blocks became finished architecture. Here, however, the temporary features became permanent. The craftsmen responsible for removing them apparently never completed their task, leaving behind a monument that preserves elements normally erased before a building entered regular use. The mystery deepens inside the colonnade. A conventional Greek temple normally enclosed a cella, or naos, forming the central architectural space associated with the deity and cult. At Segesta, evidence for a completed cella is absent or highly problematic, and the interior does not correspond neatly to what would be expected from a fully completed Doric temple of this scale. This produces a strange imbalance in the construction sequence. The expensive outer colonnade rose to monumental height, while one of the most functionally important parts of a conventional temple apparently remained unfinished. If resources were becoming scarce, concentrating so much effort on the external shell seems remarkable. If resources were still available, the question becomes why the interior and final stone finishing were never completed. The historical chronology offers a possible explanation, but not a definitive one. Segesta was an Elymian city rather than a Greek colony, although its elite interacted extensively with the Greek communities of Sicily and adopted elements of Greek architecture and culture. During the later 5th century BCE, Segesta became locked in conflict with the neighboring Greek city of Selinus. Seeking outside support, the Segestans appealed to Athens, contributing to the decision that produced the disastrous Athenian-Sicilian expedition beginning in 415 BCE. Political instability, warfare, and financial pressure, therefore, surrounded Segesta within years or decades of the temple's construction. A monumental building program could have become impossible to sustain as resources were redirected toward diplomacy and war. Yet this explanation creates its own difficulty. No surviving inscription states that construction stopped because of the conflict with Selinus, the Athenian expedition, or a specific financial crisis. Dating the building to approximately 430 to 420 BCE places it tantalizingly close to those events. But chronological proximity is not proof of causation. Construction might have slowed before the military crisis, stopped during it, or ended for reasons unrelated to warfare. Archaeology can identify unfinished surfaces with considerable confidence, but determining the exact political decision that caused craftsmen to abandon them is far harder. There is no surviving ancient account describing the final working season, no document recording the cancellation of the project, and no securely identified moment when the last mason left the site. There is also a more radical possibility. Perhaps the building was never intended to become a conventional Greek temple in the first place. Because Segesta belonged to the Elymnians, scholars have long debated how Greek architectural forms were being used by a non-Greek community. The monumental Doric exterior could have carried political and cultural meaning beyond ordinary religious architecture. Some interpretations have questioned whether the absence of a conventional cellar necessarily proves accidental abandonment, proposing that the structure may have served an unusual open-air or symbolic function. If so, part of what appears unfinished might reflect deliberate design rather than catastrophe. The surviving construction evidence makes a completely intentional explanation difficult, however. Unfluted columns alone could theoretically represent an architectural choice, but when they are considered together with unfinished surfaces and temporary stone projections, the building strongly resembles a project whose final dressing was never performed. This leaves an intriguing middle ground. The monument may have possessed an unusual purpose while still being physically unfinished. Its architects could have adapted Greek Doric forms for Elymnian needs, only for construction to cease before their complete plan was realized. The greatest unresolved question, therefore, remains the timing of the abandonment. Segesta had already invested heavily enough to raise 36 columns and much of the superstructure. The difficult process of quarrying, transporting and lifting massive architectural elements had largely succeeded. What remained included precisely the kind of work that would have transformed the rough monumental shell into finished architecture. Something changed before that transformation occurred. Whether it was war, depleted finances, political upheaval, a change in religious priorities, or a combination of pressures, cannot presently be demonstrated from the surviving evidence. Southwest of Cairo, near Zayet El Arian in Egypt, an enormous royal pyramid project was abandoned before the pyramid itself had properly risen. Its underground core had already been cut deep into the bedrock and fitted with massive granite blocks. Yet construction stopped so completely that even the identity of the ruler who ordered it remains uncertain. The site entered archaeological records most clearly through the excavations of Italian archaeologist Alessandro Barsanti between 1904 and 1912. Beneath what appeared to be an unfinished pyramid complex, Barsanti exposed a vast descending trench leading toward a T-shaped subterranean excavation. His documentation revealed something far more substantial than an abandoned survey or experimental foundation. The builders had already committed enormous resources to the underground architecture before the project was suddenly left incomplete. The intended pyramid was apparently monumental. Reconstructions based on the surviving ground plan suggest a base roughly 180 to 200 meters on each side, placing it within the scale of major royal pyramid projects. Yet almost nothing resembling a completed pyramid superstructure survives above ground. Instead, the most impressive engineering lies below it. A huge open descending passage was excavated through the limestone bedrock toward a central pit, where the builders installed a floor made from enormous granite blocks. Some were approximately 4.5 meters long, around 2.5 meters thick, and have been estimated at close to 9 tons. Granite suitable for royal monuments was commonly obtained from the Aswan region, hundreds of kilometers to the south, meaning that quarrying, transporting and positioning such material required an organized labor force and a functioning state logistical system. This was therefore not a project abandoned immediately after it began. Significant investment had already been made in the part of the monument that would eventually disappear beneath thousands of tons of masonry. At the center of this underground structure, Barsanti encountered one of its strangest features, a large oval granite vessel embedded within the floor. It measured approximately 3.15 meters long, 2.22 meters wide, and about 1.5 meters deep. Its unusual form has often led researchers to interpret it as a royal sarcophagus or burial container, although its exact function remains uncertain. Its placement is particularly important because it appears to have been installed during an early stage of construction. Moving such a massive object into the finished subterranean system would have been extremely difficult, suggesting that the builders positioned major granite components first and intended to complete the architecture around them. In other words, the surviving remains may preserve an intermediate stage in the actual sequence of pyramid construction. Yet the greatest mystery is not how the granite reached the pit, it is whose pyramid this was supposed to be. During his work, Barsanti recorded dozens of inscriptions, quarry marks, and workers' graffiti, including approximately 67 examples associated with the subterranean structure. Among them were inscriptions apparently containing a royal name written inside a cartouche. If that name could be read securely, the entire monument might be placed within a known reign. Instead, the inscription produced one of the most persistent identification problems in Old Kingdom archaeology. The second element appears to contain the hieroglyphic sign for Ka, but the preceding sign was copied in ways that have allowed several interpretations. Over the following decades, Egyptologists proposed readings including Nebka, Neferka, Bika, and Baka, while other attempts connected the monument with Setka. What looks at first like a minor problem in reading a damaged inscription changes the entire history of the pyramid, because each identification places its construction within a different political context. One of the most intriguing possibilities is Baka, a poorly documented royal figure associated with the 4th dynasty and often identified as a son of Djedefre. If Baka actually became king, his reign may have been extraordinarily short. This would provide a straightforward explanation for the monument's condition. A king ascended the throne, initiated a pyramid complex on a scale appropriate to royal status, ordered the underground burial system and expensive granite elements prepared, then died before the superstructure could advance far. Pyramid building was closely connected to the reigning monarch. A successor had little reason to devote years of state labor to completing another king's funerary monument when his own burial project required resources. Under this interpretation, Zayat el-Aryan may be the architectural footprint of a reign so brief that the ruler almost vanished from conventional historical records. The problem is that this elegant explanation depends on an identification that cannot be demonstrated with certainty. The surviving copies of the inscriptions do not permit scholars to reconstruct the royal name beyond dispute, and the monument itself contains no securely preserved inscription announcing its owner in the way researchers would want. Architectural dating has not completely resolved the issue either. Several characteristics have encouraged attribution to the 4th dynasty, particularly comparisons with the pyramid of Djedefre at Abu Rawash and the extensive use of massive granite components. Other interpretations have placed aspects of the design closer to traditions associated with the 3rd dynasty. The difference is substantial. It means researchers are not merely debating which king within a known succession owned the pyramid. They have also debated where the monument belongs within a broader period of rapidly changing pyramid architecture. This uncertainty makes the abrupt end of construction harder to reconstruct. If Baka was the owner and ruled only briefly, royal death remains a convincing explanation. But if the name belongs to another ruler, the chronology and political circumstances change. A succession crisis could have terminated the project, especially if a new ruler deliberately redirected labor and stone toward another royal complex. Administrative disruption could have produced the same result. None of these explanations, however, is confirmed by a surviving ancient text stating why the workers left. The archaeological evidence records construction stopping but not the decision that caused it. That silence becomes more striking because the underground work had already reached an advanced and expensive stage. Quarrying limestone at Zayet El Arian was relatively straightforward compared with obtaining granite, moving multi-ton blocks from southern Egypt and lowering them accurately into a deep excavation. Those operations required quarry crews, river transport, hauling teams, engineers, food supplies, and centralized administration. Yet, after accomplishing much of this difficult preparatory work, the builders apparently never transformed the site into the finished royal monument for which it had been designed. There is also no secure evidence that the intended king was ever buried there. No identifiable royal mummy or intact funerary assemblage establishes that the subterranean chamber fulfilled its final purpose. The project therefore seems to have crossed the boundary from planning into heavy construction, only to lose the political reason for continuing. Even the granite vessel adds to this uncertainty. Barsanti reported material inside it when the structure was investigated, but no modern laboratory analysis capable of establishing its original composition was performed, and the material is no longer available for the range of residue studies that could now be applied. Had a preserved sample survived, chemical and microscopic analysis might have helped determine whether the vessel contained organic substances associated with burial, ritual materials, later contamination, or something unrelated to funerary use. Instead, one of the few physical clues capable of testing the chamber's function disappeared before archaeological science possessed the techniques to examine it properly. The site itself has also remained difficult to reassess. Zayet El Arian lies within an area affected by military restrictions, limiting sustained modern archaeological access to the unfinished Northern Pyramid. Much of what researchers know consequently depends on excavations and documentation produced more than a century ago. Techniques such as high-resolution three-dimensional recording, ground-penetrating radar, systematic geophysical survey, and microscopic residue analysis could potentially answer questions that Barsanti's generation could not investigate. But the monument has never received the comprehensive modern examination that its unresolved chronology deserves. Near the ancient city of Miletus on the western coast of Turkey, the Temple of Apollo at Didyma preserves something extraordinarily rare, a monumental construction project that remained unfinished after nearly 5 centuries of intermittent work. Its ruins never truly disappeared, but systematic archaeological investigation transformed them from a vast field of fallen marble into evidence of an ancient construction process. French archaeologists began excavating at Didyma in the 19th century, followed by major German investigations from the early 20th century onward. As collapsed blocks were documented and buried architectural surfaces exposed, researchers realized that they were not looking simply at a temple destroyed after completion. Tool marks, unfinished columns, partially carved ornament, and even full-scale architectural drawings remained where ancient builders had left them, revealing a structure that had never reached its intended final state. The surviving temple belongs largely to a rebuilding program begun around 300 BCE, after Alexander the Great's conquest of the region and the revival of the famous Oracle of Apollo at Didyma. The ambition was enormous. The temple platform measured roughly 109 by 51 meters, and the exterior was planned as a double Ionic colonnade containing more than 100 columns. The largest columns rose almost 20 meters, comparable to a 6-story building, with shafts close to 2 meters in diameter. Behind them lay a highly unusual interior arrangement, monumental steps, narrow vaulted passages, and an enormous open-air adyton containing the sacred spring associated with Apollo's oracle. The building was therefore not merely large. Almost every major component required expensive quarrying, transportation, lifting, and precision stonework on a scale that could consume generations. Yet generations were exactly what Didyma received. Construction accounts carved into stone show organized work continuing during the Hellenistic period, while architectural evidence indicates additional activity under Roman rule centuries later. Different rulers inherited the unfinished sanctuary and chose to invest in it again. Seleucid patronage helped support the early project. Later authorities continued portions of the work, and Roman emperors remained interested in the sanctuary. Caligula reportedly intended to complete the temple, while architectural elements were still being produced or finished during the imperial period. By the 2nd century CE, roughly 500 years had passed since the Great Rebuilding began, and the monument was still incomplete. That extraordinary duration creates the central problem of Didyma, a construction project abandoned after a war, economic collapse, or the death of its patron is easy to understand. Didyma was different because it repeatedly survived such interruptions. Work stopped, returned, slowed, and returned again. Political systems changed around it. Kingdoms disappeared. Rome took control of Western Anatolia, and new generations of builders inherited a design conceived centuries before their birth. If the project remained important enough to restart repeatedly, why did nobody finally complete it? Part of the answer may lie in the mathematics of its scale. A single giant Ionic column required multiple enormous marble drums to be quarried, transported, and stacked with extraordinary accuracy before fluting and final finishing could even begin. Multiply that process by more than 100 columns, then add capitals, bases, architraves, walls, stairways, and elaborate sculptural decoration, and the temple becomes less like a normal building project than a permanent economic institution. Ancient building accounts suggest that construction advanced incrementally rather than through one uninterrupted campaign. A sanctuary could remain functional while craftsmen worked on selected architectural elements, meaning there was no absolute requirement that every planned surface be completed before religious activity continued. The unfinished stone itself makes this visible. Several columns and architectural blocks preserve rough surfaces that would normally have disappeared beneath final dressing and polishing. Some column bases display extraordinary ornament, while nearby components remain incomplete. This unevenness is difficult to explain through a single catastrophic abandonment. Instead, the building appears to have been caught at many different stages of construction simultaneously. One team could be finishing decorative carving, while another prepared structural elements elsewhere, and when funding or political support weakened, whatever happened to be unfinished simply remained unfinished. Even more remarkable evidence survives on the walls of the Adyton. Archaeologists identified extremely fine incised lines forming large-scale architectural drawings. These were effectively construction drawings made directly onto stone surfaces, including geometric layouts for columns, bases, and other architectural components. Such lines were never meant to remain visible. Once construction progressed, final surface treatment should have erased them. Their survival therefore captures a stage in the building process that completed Greek temples almost never preserve. Didyma is not only an unfinished monument. Parts of it retain the working geometry used by the people attempting to finish it. Those drawings also introduce another complication. Not every traced design corresponds perfectly with the architecture as eventually constructed. Measurements associated with some proposed elements differ from surviving finished components, raising the possibility that architects revised portions of the design while construction was already underway. On a project spanning centuries, such changes would hardly be surprising. Different architects inherited old plans, religious requirements evolved, patrons changed, and technical decisions made around 300 BCE could confront builders working under completely different political and economic conditions centuries later. Every major alteration potentially created more work, while the original program itself remained incomplete. External crises repeatedly added to the problem. The sanctuary existed through wars and political instability in the eastern Mediterranean, including disturbances involving Galatian forces during the 3rd century BCE and piracy affecting the region in the 1st century BCE. Yet none provides a satisfying single date for the abandonment of construction, because activity resumed afterward. This is what makes Didyma so unusual within the category of unfinished ancient sites. There was apparently no single moment when everyone put down their tools and never returned. The temple experienced repeated cycles of interruption and revival, each one extending the life of a project whose enormous scale may already have exceeded the resources available for continuous construction. Its religious function may explain why this situation could continue for so long. Didyma was one of the major oracular sanctuaries of the Greek world, connected with nearby Miletus by the Sacred Way. Pilgrims did not necessarily require a perfectly finished architectural shell for the oracle to operate. The sacred spring, ritual spaces, and cult of Apollo could remain meaningful, while columns outside were still awaiting their final carving. In practical terms, the sanctuary could succeed while the building project failed. That distinction may be the key to understanding why later patrons repeatedly spent money on sections of the temple without committing enough resources to complete every part of the original design. By the 2nd century CE, the Greek traveler Pausanias could still describe the sanctuary in terms that reflected its unfinished state. That means the incompletion was not simply a conclusion reached by archaeologists examining damaged ruins 2,000 years later. Ancient observers themselves encountered a colossal monument whose construction had never fully reached its intended end. The mystery is therefore not whether Didyma was unfinished, but why centuries of renewed effort never overcame that condition. There is no evidence for a lost technology or an unexplained catastrophe. The surviving evidence points towards something more unusual, an architectural ambition so enormous that it outlived the political and economic circumstances that created it. Each generation could add another section, halve another base, or raise another column, yet completing the entire design demanded sustained resources across a timescale ancient patrons rarely controlled. Didyma became a monument built not for years, but across civilizations, beginning in the Hellenistic world and continuing deep into the Roman period. Temple of Olympian Zeus at Agrigento, on the southern coast of Sicily, Italy, was designed as one of the largest temples ever attempted in the Greek world. Yet after decades of construction, its builders appear to have left it unfinished. The ruins belong to ancient Archaeagus, one of the wealthiest Greek cities in the western Mediterranean. The temple was already famous in antiquity, and the surviving remains were later described and studied by travelers and archaeologists as the monumental sanctuary was gradually reconstructed from fallen blocks scattered across the site. What emerged was not simply the wreckage of a completed building. Architectural evidence indicated that the Olympion itself may never have reached the finished state envisioned by its designers, leaving archaeologists with the unusual problem of reconstructing a monument whose final form may never have existed. Construction is generally associated with the period following the Battle of Himera in 480 BCE, when the Greek forces of Sicily defeated a Carthaginian army. Archaeagus entered a period of extraordinary prosperity, and the Olympion appears to have been conceived on a scale appropriate to that political confidence. Its stylobate measured approximately 112.7 by 56.3 meters, making the building one of the largest Doric temples known from antiquity. Yet roughly 70 years later, when Carthaginian forces captured Acragas in 406 BCE, the enormous sanctuary was apparently still unfinished. That gap of more than 7 decades is the central problem surrounding the monument. War provides a convincing explanation for why work could have stopped permanently in 406 BCE, but it does not explain why a project of such political and religious importance had required so long without reaching completion. Part of the answer may lie in the unprecedented engineering demanded by the design. The Olympion was not simply an ordinary Doric temple enlarged to monumental dimensions. Instead of a conventional outer colonnade of completely freestanding columns, its enormous half-columns were integrated with walls or screens between them. Estimates reconstructed from the surviving architectural fragments indicate columns approaching 17 meters in height. Building at this scale dramatically increased the weight that foundations and upper architectural elements had to support, while also making quarrying, transportation, lifting, and precise placement increasingly difficult. The builders attempted to control some of these problems by assembling large architectural members from multiple stone blocks, rather than relying entirely on gigantic monolithic pieces. Even so, every additional meter of height increased the complexity of scaffolding, lifting equipment, and structural stability. The most extraordinary components were the colossal male figures now called telemonies or atlantes. Reconstructed examples reach roughly 7.5 meters in height, comparable to a multi-story building. They were assembled from separate blocks and are generally interpreted as having occupied elevated positions within the temple's architectural system. Their exact arrangement, however, has long been debated because the upper structure collapsed and much of the building was subsequently dismantled. Scholars, therefore, have to infer their positions from surviving fragments, architectural relationships, and historical descriptions. This uncertainty matters because the telemonies belong to precisely the portion of the monument most difficult to reconstruct. Some elements may represent parts that had already been installed, while others could conceivably belong to phases that had not reached their intended final arrangement when construction ended. This leads to an even larger unresolved question. How much of the temple was actually complete by 406 BCE? Foundations, walls, and massive architectural components demonstrate that the project advanced far beyond an abandoned foundation. Yet determining whether the entire upper structure and roof were ever finished is considerably harder. Ancient Greek temples required heavy timber roofing systems covered with tiles, supported by carefully coordinated stone architecture below. At the dimensions of the Olympion, spanning and covering the building would have required enormous quantities of timber and precise management of loads at a scale rarely attempted in Greek architecture. Because the monument survives mainly as collapsed masonry and displaced blocks, archaeologists cannot simply point to an intact structural level marking the final stage reached by the builders. The 70-year construction period therefore becomes more significant than the Carthaginian destruction itself. Monumental Greek temples could take decades to complete, especially when political priorities, finances, and labor supplies changed. So a long building history is not inherently mysterious. But the Olympion combined exceptional size with an architectural system that had few close parallels. Its unusual form raises the possibility that construction progressed slowly because the project continually demanded resources and technical solutions beyond those required for conventional temples. There is no surviving ancient document recording a catastrophic engineering failure, and the ruins cannot prove that the design was structurally impossible. Nevertheless, the absence of a completed monument means the hypothesis cannot be dismissed simply by assuming that the builders would eventually have solved every problem. economic conditions may have been equally important. A project measuring more than 100 meters in length required a sustained supply of quarried stone, specialized craftsmen, transport workers, and large labor forces over generations. Political monuments are easiest to begin during periods of exceptional wealth, but maintaining that investment for decades is much harder. If the Olympian originated in the triumphant decades after Himera, its initial ambitions may have reflected circumstances that did not remain constant throughout the 5th century BCE. Construction could have slowed long before the final Carthaginian attack, leaving an enormous but incomplete sanctuary whose remaining work became increasingly difficult to justify or finance. Archaeology can identify the unfinished condition far more easily than it can reconstruct the annual flow of money, labor, and political commitment that determined the building schedule. The events of 406 BCE then provide the clearest historical breaking point. Carthaginian forces besieged and captured Acragas, ending the political environment in which such an enormous civic project had been conceived. If substantial work remained at that moment, the invasion would have removed the resources, organization, and stability necessary to continue it. Yet, the irony is unusually sharp. The temple is traditionally connected with the prosperity that followed a Greek victory over Carthage at Himera, only for construction to remain incomplete until Carthage returned and conquered the city approximately 7 decades later. A monument conceived during one of Acragas's greatest periods of power may therefore have been permanently frozen by the enemy whose earlier defeat helped create the circumstances for its construction. There is also the question of whether unfinished meant unusable. Ancient sanctuaries could function while architectural work continued, and religious activity did not necessarily wait for every decorative or structural element of a monumental complex to be completed. The Olympian may therefore have served a ceremonial purpose during some stages of its prolonged construction. If so, generations of inhabitants could have known it simultaneously as a sacred monument and an active building site. This possibility makes its final interruption harder to define. There may never have been a single moment when builders consciously decided to abandon the project. Work could instead have slowed, stopped temporarily, resumed in limited form, and finally become impossible after the political catastrophe of 406 BCE. Later destruction erased much of the evidence that might have resolved these questions. Earthquakes contributed to the collapse, while stone was removed and reused during subsequent centuries. What survives is therefore neither a complete building nor an untouched ancient construction site. Researchers are reconstructing the intended architecture from foundations, displaced masonry, column fragments, and pieces of the enormous telemones, while simultaneously trying to determine which elements had actually reached their intended positions. This creates an unusual archaeological paradox. Every reconstruction of the completed Olympian risks showing a building that ancient people themselves may never have seen.
Modern-day Kosovo hides the ruins of Ulpiana, one of the strangest engineering mysteries of the Roman world. At first glance, Ulpiana appears to be another forgotten Roman city buried beneath centuries of destruction, but beneath its collapsed basilicas and broken roads lies evidence of something far more difficult to explain. A city with advanced urban planning, underground heating systems, earthquake-resistant foundations, and metallurgical technology that may have exceeded what historians once believed possible for the Balkans nearly 2,000 years ago. The greatest mystery of all is not that Ulpiana existed, but how its engineers achieved such precision using tools and resources supposedly limited by the ancient world. Ulpiana was officially identified during archaeological surveys in the 19th century, but systematic excavations expanded dramatically during the 20th century as researchers uncovered massive public buildings, Roman roads, water systems, workshops, and Christian basilicas spread across a surprisingly organized urban layout. Each excavation season revealed more evidence that Ulpiana was not a minor provincial settlement. Instead, it may have functioned as one of the most technologically sophisticated urban centers in the Central Balkans during the late Roman Empire. One of the first mysteries that shocked archaeologists was the city's geometric planning. Ulpiana followed a near-perfect orthogonal grid system, similar to the urban layout seen in Roman cities like Timgad or Pompeii. But unlike those cities, Ulpiana stood in a region with uneven terrain and frequent seismic instability. Despite this, major roads remained aligned with remarkable precision. Some streets deviated by only a few degrees after nearly 2 millennia of earthquakes, erosion, invasions, and structural collapse. Researchers studying Roman surveying techniques believe engineers may have used highly advanced Groma-based alignment systems combined with astronomical positioning methods. Yet the consistency across the city still raises questions about how such precision was maintained without modern instruments. Beneath those roads, archaeologists uncovered another technological puzzle: an extensive underground drainage and water management network. Stone sewers ran beneath major streets with carefully calculated gradients that allowed wastewater to flow continuously without generating excessive erosion. In several sections, the stone blocks fit together so tightly that even modern researchers were surprised by the level of cutting precision. Similar hydraulic sophistication existed in larger Roman cities like Rome or Ephesus, but Ulpiana was located far from the imperial core. The existence of infrastructure on this scale suggests the transfer of highly specialized engineering knowledge deep into the Balkans much earlier than historians previously assumed. The city also contained evidence of hypocaust systems, one of Rome's most advanced heating technologies. Hot air circulated beneath floors and through hollow wall spaces to heat baths and public buildings. While hypocaust systems existed elsewhere in the Roman world, some of the construction materials discovered in Ulpiana displayed unusual durability. Laboratory analysis of surviving bricks revealed high resistance to thermal stress and moisture, despite exposure to centuries of environmental damage. Certain clay mixtures appear to contain mineral compositions that improved heat tolerance beyond what researchers expected from standard Roman brick production. Some scientists now suspect local craftsmen may have modified traditional Roman formulas using Balkan mineral resources to create more resilient building materials. Another mystery surrounds Ulpiana's apparent resistance to earthquakes. Historical records indicate the region experienced multiple destructive seismic events during antiquity, including a major earthquake in the year 518 CE that devastated much of the Balkans. Yet parts of Ulpiana's foundations survived remarkably well. Excavations revealed layered construction techniques using combinations of stone and gravel and mortar that may have dispersed seismic energy rather than transmitting it directly upward into walls. Similar engineering principles appear in much later earthquake-resistant structures, including some Inca constructions in Peruvian Byzantine architecture in Anatolia. The possibility that Roman engineers in Ulpiana intentionally designed foundations to absorb ground movement remains heavily debated among archaeologists. But the greatest and most controversial mystery of Ulpiana involves metallurgy and furnace temperature control. The city stood near mineral-rich regions containing lead, silver, iron, and other valuable ores. Archaeological surveys uncovered traces of workshops, slag deposits, smelting residues, and metal processing tools, suggesting that Ulpiana was deeply connected to industrial-scale production. What surprised researchers was the consistency of several metal artifacts recovered from the site. Scientific analysis showed unusually stable alloy compositions, implying precise control over furnace conditions during smelting and forging. This should not have been easy. Ancient furnaces were notoriously difficult to regulate. Without thermometers or modern airflow systems, maintaining consistent temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius required extraordinary skill. Yet some iron and bronze artifacts from El Piana show metallurgical uniformity that rivals production standards from much later periods. Certain samples displayed carbon distribution suggesting controlled heating cycles rather than random exposure to fluctuating fire conditions. Researchers comparing El Piana's metallurgical remains to Roman industrial centres in Britain and Hispania noticed another anomaly. The slag composition indicated extremely efficient ore separation. In simple terms, the furnaces extracted a surprisingly high percentage of usable metal while minimizing waste. This level of efficiency required not only advanced furnace design, but also deep understanding of airflow, fuel management, and mineral chemistry. Some theories suggest that Ulpiana's metallurgists may have used specialized furnace chambers capable of sustaining hotter and more stable combustion zones than typical Roman provincial workshops. Others believe the key may have been the local mineral composition itself. Certain Balkan ores contain tracer elements that alter smelting behavior under high heat, potentially allowing craftsmen to achieve cleaner metal extraction with fewer impurities. But even this explanation does not fully solve the mystery, because successful smelting still depended on extremely careful control of oxygen flow and temperature balance. Experimental archaeologists attempting to recreate Roman furnaces have discovered how difficult this process actually was. Small changes in airflow could reduce furnace temperatures by hundreds of degrees. Excess oxygen could weaken the metal, while insufficient oxygen could leave large quantities of unprocessed ore trapped inside the slag. Yet Ulpiana's metalworkers appear to have maintained remarkable consistency over extended production periods. Even more puzzling are indications that some workshops may have operated continuously for long durations. Continuous furnace operation required coordinated fuel supply systems and precise labour organisation. Producing enough charcoal alone would have demanded large-scale resource management across surrounding forests. This suggests Ulpiana may not have been merely a provincial town, but an industrial centre integrated into major Roman economic networks. The mystery deepens further when researchers compare Ulpiana to other Roman cities destroyed during the collapse of imperial authority in the Balkans. In many regions, technological complexity declined rapidly after repeated invasions during the 5th and 6th centuries, but evidence from Ulpian suggests that sophisticated engineering and industrial production continued even during periods of instability. Some rebuilt structures actually use stronger materials than earlier phases of construction, implying that local craftsmen continued improving techniques rather than losing them. What do you think about Ulpiana's lost engineering knowledge? Could ancient civilizations have mastered technologies far beyond what we officially recognize today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. More than 1,400 meters above sea level on the western slopes of Mount Lawu in central Java, Indonesia, Setho Temple remained hidden for centuries beneath volcanic mist and dense tropical vegetation before Dutch colonial researchers documented the site in the 19th century. Archaeologists later confirmed that the complex dates to the late Majapahit era, around the 15th century, yet almost everything about its construction feels older, stranger, and technologically inconsistent with many other Javanese temples from the same period. Unlike the famous volcanic stone towers of Borobudur or Prambanan, Setho rises as a sequence of ascending terraces carved directly into a steep mountain slope, resembling a step pyramid more commonly associated with Mesoamerican civilizations than Southeast Asian Hindu architecture. The first mystery begins with the mountain itself. Mount Lawu is not an easy place to build. The region receives heavy tropical rainfall, thick fog covers the slopes for much of the year, and volcanic soil is highly unstable. Modern geologists explain that steep volcanic terrain is especially vulnerable to erosion and landslides because water rapidly penetrates porous ash-rich soil layers. Yet Setho Temple has remained structurally stable for over 500 years. The terraces still hold their alignment with remarkable precision despite centuries of monsoon rains and seismic activity. Engineers studying the site believe the builders understood advanced slope stabilization techniques long before such principles were formally documented in engineering science. What makes the structure extraordinary is the way the terraces distribute pressure across the mountainside. Rather than relying heavily on mortar, many sections appear to use tightly interlocked volcanic stones, positioned at angles that naturally redirect weight downward into the slope. Similar pressure locking methods are visible in the stonework of Machu Picchu, where Inca engineers built earthquake-resistant walls by allowing stones to shift slightly during seismic movement without collapsing. The civilizations had no known contact, yet both developed remarkably comparable structural solutions for mountainous terrain. At Setho, some retaining walls remain upright even after centuries of tropical water exposure that would normally weaken ancient masonry. Archaeological surveys also suggest the temple contains a hidden drainage system beneath the terraces. During intense rainstorms, water appears to disappear rapidly through narrow stone channels instead of accumulating against the foundations. Modern hydrological engineers consider drainage one of the most critical components of mountain construction because trapped water dramatically increases landslide risk. Some researchers estimate that without effective drainage, the terraces would have failed centuries ago under Java's annual rainfall, which can exceed 3,000 millimeters in mountainous regions. Yet much of the underground system remains buried or inaccessible, leaving experts uncertain how sophisticated the original engineering truly was. Another unexplained feature involves the selection of volcanic stone itself. Many of the blocks show unusually low levels of surface deterioration despite constant humidity. Tropical climates normally accelerate chemical weathering because water penetrates microscopic pores in stone and expands biological growth such as moss and lichen. However, several sections of Setho's masonry remain comparatively intact. Material analysts believe the builders may have deliberately selected denser volcanic andesite with lower water absorption properties. In some areas, the stones also appear shaped with tiny outward slopes and narrow micro-channels that redirect rainfall away from joints, reducing internal moisture build-up. These details resemble passive water management strategies found in later engineered fortifications, yet Setho predates many of them by centuries. The layout of the temple raises even deeper questions. Unlike most classical Javanese Hindu temples centered around towering sanctuaries, Setho progresses upward through a sequence of open terraces aligned along a central axis. From above, the structure resembles a ceremonial pathway ascending toward the mountain summit. Some historians argue this design reflects older indigenous mountain worship traditions merged with Hindu cosmology during the decline of the Majapahit Empire. Others believe the architecture served astronomical purposes in addition to ritual functions. Several researchers studying the orientation of the terraces observe that certain gateways align closely with seasonal solar positions. During specific times of the year, sunlight reportedly passes through multiple stone entrances at nearly perfect angles during sunrise. Ancient civilizations across the world often use solar alignments to regulate agricultural calendars and ceremonial events. Similar phenomena exist at Chichen Itza, where the Pyramid of El Castillo produces a serpent-shaped shadow during equinoxes, and at Stonehenge, where the monument aligns with the summer solstice sunrise. At Ketho, however, The exact intention behind these alignments remains uncertain because many original ceremonial records disappeared with the collapse of Majapahit power. The carvings found throughout the complex add another layer of mystery. Unlike the refined royal iconography seen in major Hindu temples, Ketho contains unusual reliefs involving fertility imagery, human figures, and symbolic motifs that appear tied to older animist traditions. Some depictions are considered highly unorthodox within mainstream Hindu temple art. Historians suspect the mountain sanctuary may have functioned as an esoteric ritual center, where local spiritual practices blended with imported Hindu beliefs. This hybridization reflects a transitional period in Javanese history, when political authority weakened and isolated mountain communities preserved older traditions outside royal control. Even more puzzling is the apparent absence of extensive written documentation describing the temple's construction techniques. The Majapahit Empire produced inscriptions, literature, and administrative records, yet none provide a detailed explanation of how complex mountain engineering projects like Setho were executed. This silence has led some researchers to speculate that much of the technical knowledge existed as orally transmitted expertise among specialized builder groups. Once those groups disappeared, the construction methods vanished with them. Modern archaeological technology has only deepened the mystery. Ground-penetrating surveys around Mount Lau detected anomalies beneath several sections near the terraces, suggesting buried chambers or additional structural foundations. Local legends long claimed hidden tunnels existed beneath the mountain sanctuary, though no complete excavation has confirmed them. Because the terrain remains unstable and parts of the site are vulnerable to landslides, large-scale excavation has been limited. As a result, significant portions of the complex may still remain underground. The temple's location itself may not have been chosen purely for spiritual symbolism. Mountains with volcanic activity often produce unusual electromagnetic conditions due to mineral-rich rock formations beneath the surface. Some visitors and researchers have reported compass inconsistencies and strange atmospheric sensations around Mount Lau, though no definitive scientific explanation connects these experiences directly to the temple. Still, ancient civilizations frequently selected high-altitude volcanic sites for sacred architecture, possibly because dramatic landscapes reinforce spiritual authority and cosmological beliefs. Comparisons with other ancient mountain complexes reveal how unusual Setho truly is. The terrace engineering resembles Inca stabilization systems in Peru. The ceremonial ascent recalls Mesoamerican step pyramids. The solar alignments parallel monuments in Britain and Egypt. Yet Setho emerged independently within the isolated volcanic landscapes of Java during the final centuries of one of Southeast Asia's greatest empires. This convergence of engineering ideas across disconnected civilizations remains one of archaeology's most fascinating patterns. Do you think the builders of Setho Temple possessed engineering knowledge far ahead of their time, or are modern historians still underestimating ancient civilizations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Pucará de Quito stands on a steep rocky hill just north of San Pedro de Atacama in northern Chile, inside one of the harshest environments ever inhabited by humans. The Atacama Desert receives less than 1 millimeter of rainfall annually in some regions, and certain weather stations there have recorded years without measurable rain at all. Yet on the barren volcanic landscape, archaeologists discovered the remains of a fortified settlement built centuries before the arrival of the Spanish. The site first attracted serious archaeological attention during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when explorers and researchers studying the ancient Atacameño civilization documented more than 100 interconnected stone structures climbing the mountainside. Excavations later revealed defensive walls, narrow access routes, storage areas, lookout positions, and residential sectors built directly into the natural rock formation. At first glance, the ruins appear crude compared to places like Machu Picchu or Sacsayhuaman, but the deeper researchers studied Pucara de Quito, the stranger it became, because the true mystery was not decorative beauty. The mystery was survival. Everything about this fortress suggests engineering decisions specifically adapted for one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. And some of those decisions still are not fully understood. The most astonishing aspect of Pucara de Quito is the terrain itself. The fortress was not built on a flat plateau. It was constructed across an uneven volcanic hillside filled with unstable rock, steep inclines and narrow ridges. Even modern construction on similar terrain requires geological surveys, stabilization systems, drainage planning, and heavy equipment. Yet centuries ago, the Atacameño people somehow transformed this hostile slope into a layered defensive complex. Researchers estimate that the site once contained more than 100 stone structures connected through elevated terraces and narrow passageways. Many walls were built without mortar using irregular volcanic stones gathered from the surrounding environment. Under normal conditions, such dry stacked walls should gradually collapse due to gravity, erosion, thermal expansion, and seismic activity. But many sections still survive. This becomes even more difficult to explain when considering the climate of the Atacama. Daytime temperatures can exceed 30 degrees Celsius before falling close to freezing at night. That constant thermal expansion and contraction slowly destroys most exposed stone architecture over time. Modern engineers consider repeated thermal cycling one of the major causes of structural fatigue in desert environments. Yet Pucara endured for centuries. Some archaeologists believe the builders intentionally designed the walls to flex slightly under pressure, rather than resist movement rigidly. Instead of forcing the mountain into geometric order, they adapted each structure to the existing terrain. The walls follow natural fractures in the rock, distributing weight across uneven surfaces instead of fighting against them. This philosophy resembles engineering techniques later associated with Inca construction. At sites like Machu Picchu, builders integrated architecture directly into mountain geometry to reduce earthquake damage. But Pucara de Quito predates major Inca expansion into the region. That raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps sophisticated mountain engineering traditions already existed in the Andes long before historians assumed. Even more mysterious is the logistics behind construction. Transporting large quantities of stone uphill at an altitude of over 2,400 meters in an arid desert would have required enormous labor coordination. There were no draft animals capable of hauling massive loads like horses or oxen before European arrival. Llamas could carry only limited weight, usually less than 40 kilograms. Everything else depended on human labor. And still an entire fortress emerged from the mountain. Pucara de Quito was not merely a village surrounded by walls, it was a carefully designed military position. The fortress overlooks the narrow approaches leading into the San Pedro oasis, giving defenders visual control over movement through the valley. Attackers climbing towards the site would have been forced through restricted pathways exposed from above. Defensive walls were layered vertically so that even if one section fell, higher levels could continue resisting. Military historians studying ancient fortifications often compare defensive advantage through elevation ratios. At Pucara, defenders occupied terrain that naturally multiplied the effectiveness of even small groups. A handful of warriors stationed above could potentially repel much larger attacking forces struggling uphill across exposed rock. But this creates another mystery. Why would a relatively small desert society invest so much labor into military infrastructure? One theory suggests constant warfare between competing oasis communities. Another argues the fortress protected caravan trade routes connecting the Atacama with the Andes and Pacific coast. Archaeological evidence confirms long-distance exchange networks involving copper, turquoise, obsidian, shell materials, and hallucinogenic plants. However, some researchers believe the scale of the defences exceeds what would normally be expected for local tribal conflicts alone. The site appears designed for prolonged resistance, and history proved that design worked. When Spanish forces under Francisco de Aguirre attacked the fortress in the 16th century, indigenous defenders reportedly resisted fiercely despite facing steel weapons and cavalry. Even with superior technology, conquering the position was difficult because the terrain itself functioned as part of the fortress. The mountain had become a weapon. The Atacama Desert is often described as the closest environment on Earth to Mars. NASA has repeatedly used parts of the region to test instruments intended for Martian exploration because of the extreme dryness and mineral composition. In some areas, microorganisms survive only deep beneath salt crusts where traces of moisture remain trapped. Yet ancient people lived here. That alone is extraordinary. Excavations around Pucará de Quitor uncovered storage structures, agricultural evidence, irrigation traces, and preserved organic material. Researchers discovered that nearby oasis systems fed by underground Andean snowmelt allowed limited farming despite the surrounding desert. But the scale of coordination required remains difficult to explain. Water management in hyper-arid environments is incredibly complex. A single miscalculation can destroy entire communities. Modern desert agriculture depends heavily on pumps, reservoirs, climate monitoring, and engineered distribution systems. Ancient Atacameño societies had none of these technologies, and yet they survived for centuries. Some scientists believe the people of the region developed highly specialized environmental knowledge passed through generations. They may have understood underground water movements, seasonal melt patterns, and evaporation behavior with remarkable precision. There is also evidence suggesting strategic food preservation techniques. The extreme dryness naturally mummifies organic matter, dramatically slowing bacterial decay. Some researchers propose the inhabitants may have intentionally used the desert climate itself as a preservation system for stored crops and supplies. In other words, the environment that should have killed them may have become part of their technology. Seen from a distance, Pucará de Quitor almost vanishes into the surrounding landscape. This is one of the fortress's most overlooked mysteries. Unlike monumental civilizations that emphasize visibility and symbolic power, the builders here appear to have prioritized concealment and terrain integration. The stone coloration matches the volcanic hillside so closely that many structures become difficult to distinguish until viewed nearby or from above. Modern military camouflage operates on similar principles, breaking recognizable outlines, reducing visual contrast, and merging artificial structures with natural surroundings. Whether intentional or not, Pucará achieves exactly that effect. The defensive advantage would have been enormous. Approaching enemies unfamiliar with the terrain could have difficulty identifying entrances, defensive positions, or the true scale of the settlement until already exposed. Again, this suggests planning beyond simple survival. It suggests strategic engineering. What do you think? Was Pucará de Quitor simply a desert fortress, or evidence that ancient civilizations understood environmental engineering far better than we realize today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On the southwestern edge of Orongo, where cliffs plunge more than 300 meters into the Pacific Ocean and volcanic winds strike with almost uninterrupted force, an ancient ceremonial village was built in a place many engineers today would consider irrational. Perched directly on the rim of the Ranokau crater, Orongo remains one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in Polynesia. What makes the site extraordinary is not massive pyramids or giant temples, but something far harder to explain. A small isolated society appears to have mastered environmental engineering techniques centuries ahead of what researchers expected from a remote oceanic culture. Even today, archaeologists, geologists, and structural engineers continue debating how its stone architecture survived one of the harshest coastal environments on Earth. Orongo first drew serious scientific attention in the 19th century when European explorers documented strange low stone houses and hundreds of petroglyphs carved into volcanic rock overlooking the sea. Systematic archaeological work expanded during the 20th century, particularly through investigations by Catherine Routledge in the early 1900s and later expeditions led by William Malloy. Excavations revealed that Orongo was not an ordinary settlement, but the ceremonial centre of the Birdman cult, a powerful ritual system that dominated Rapa Nui society after the decline of the Moai building era. The village sits beside the crater lake of Rana Kau, one of the island's main freshwater sources, while directly facing the offshore islets Motu Nui, Motu Iti and Motu Kau Kau. This location alone created a logistical paradox. The terrain combines unstable volcanic slopes, violent ocean winds, salt corrosion, seismic activity, and dangerous elevation changes. Yet Orongo's structures endured for centuries with surprising structural stability. The first great mystery surrounding Orongo is its improbable construction site. Most ancient coastal settlements were built in protected harbours or valleys where resources and shelter were easier to secure. Orongo was built at the exact opposite extreme. Wind speed around the crater rim can exceed 80 km per hour during storm conditions, while the cliffside experiences constant salt-laden air capable of accelerating stone erosion. Geological surveys have shown that the volcanic tuff and basalt around the crater are highly fractured and vulnerable to long-term weathering. In practical engineering terms, this should have been a poor place for durable architecture. Yet dozens of ceremonial houses survived long enough to remain identifiable centuries later. Researchers comparing Orongo to other Polynesian settlements noticed something remarkable. The village appears intentionally designed to cooperate with the environment instead of resisting it directly. This becomes most visible in what many experts consider Orongo's greatest unsolved technological mystery: its wind-resistant and earthquake-resistant architecture. The houses at Orongo are extremely low to the ground, often only a little over 1 metre high internally. Early explorers incorrectly assumed the buildings reflected primitive limitations. Modern structural analysis suggests the opposite. Their low aerodynamic profile dramatically reduced lateral wind pressure. Instead of presenting vertical walls to the ocean winds, the structures hugged the terrain like stone shells. Some engineers compare the concept to partially buried military bunkers, or aerodynamic storm-resistant shelters used in modern extreme weather regions. The roofing system is even more astonishing. The roofs were formed using overlapping basalt slabs arranged into corbel-like vaults. This technique distributed compressive loads outward while minimizing structural weak points. In seismic engineering, low center of gravity structures perform better during ground movement because they reduce overturning forces. Rapa Nui lies in a tectonically active region connected to volcanic processes, meaning ancient builders likely experienced periodic tremors. The architecture at Orongo unintentionally, nor perhaps intentionally, follows principles similar to anti-seismic construction used thousands of years later in earthquake-prone civilizations. What makes this difficult to explain is the technological context. The Rapa Nui people possessed no iron tools, no wheeled transport, and no draft animals. Yet many basalt slabs used in the roofs weigh hundreds of kilograms. Transporting them uphill across volcanic slopes would have required coordinated labour, advanced planning and deep understanding of stone balancing techniques. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate similar transportation methods using ropes and wooden sled systems, but the energy requirements remain enormous relative to the island's small population estimates. Some researchers believe Orongo's builders possessed highly specialized construction knowledge passed through generations, knowledge later lost after societal collapse and European contact. Another extraordinary feature is the precision of water management around the crater edge. Heavy Pacific rainfall can rapidly destabilize volcanic slopes through runoff erosion. However, surveys of Orongo revealed carefully integrated drainage patterns between structures. Stone channels appear positioned to redirect water away from foundations while minimizing soil displacement. Similar environmental adaptation techniques are seen in Inca mountain architecture at sites like Machu Picchu, where drainage engineering was critical to slope stability. The difference is scale. The Inca Empire possessed enormous labor resources and continental infrastructure. Rapa Nui was an isolated island thousands of kilometers from major civilizations. That comparison makes Orongo's engineering even more difficult to contextualize historically. The second major mystery involves the hundreds of petroglyphs carved throughout the ceremonial complex. Orongo contains one of the densest concentrations of rock art in Polynesia, especially depictions of Tangata Manu, the birdman figure central to the island's ritual system. Many carvings were etched into hard basalt surfaces using only stone tools. Some display surprisingly smooth curvature and proportional consistency. Replication experiments conducted by archaeologists demonstrated how time-consuming such carvings would have been with obsidian or basalt chisels. Yet the sheer number of petroglyphs suggests long-term organized artistic production. Several glyphs align visually with the offshore islet Motu Nui and with seasonal solar positions. This has led some archaeoastronomers to suspect Orongo also functioned as a ritual observation center linked to celestial cycles. Polynesian navigators already possessed advanced oceanic navigation skills based on stars, currents, wave reflection patterns, and bird migration. Some scholars believe the birdman ceremonies may have incorporated astronomical timing systems connected to seabird migration seasons. If true, Orongo may represent a fusion of religious architecture, environmental engineering, and observational astronomy within a single ceremonial landscape. The birdman ritual itself introduces another layer of mystery. Competitors descended nearly vertical cliffs from Orongo to the ocean below, then swam through shark-filled waters to Motu Nui in search of the first Manutara egg of the season. The winner's sponsor became the island's ceremonial leader for the year. From a survival perspective, the ritual bordered on suicidal, yet it continued for generations. Oceanographers studying the currents around Ranokau describe the waters as highly unpredictable due to wave reflection from volcanic cliffs and shifting Pacific swells. Successfully completing the journey required extraordinary physical endurance and intimate knowledge of marine conditions. This suggests the Rapa Nui possessed sophisticated practical understanding of seasonal weather systems and ocean dynamics long before modern meteorology existed. One of the deepest mysteries connected to Orongo involves the possibility of symbolic communication systems linked to Rongorongo, the undeciphered script of Rapa Nui. Some birdman imagery resembles motifs found on surviving Rongorongo tablets. If Rongorongo represents a true writing system rather than symbolic memory aids, then Rapa Nui may have independently developed one of the few known scripts in human history without direct influence from major literate civilizations. That possibility would radically reshape assumptions about intellectual development in isolated Polynesian societies. Unfortunately, most Rongorongo artifacts were lost during colonial disruption, disease outbreaks, and missionary destruction in the 19th century, leaving researchers with too little material for complete decipherment. What do you think Orongo truly represents? A forgotten engineering breakthrough, a lost ceremonial science or evidence that the ancient Rapa Nui understood nature far better than we realise today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Far above the western shore of the Caspian Sea in modern-day Azerbaijan, Beshbarmag Mountain rises like a giant stone fang from the earth. For thousands of years, travellers crossing the Silk Road stopped beneath this isolated mountain, believing it was a sacred gateway between the human world and the heavens. Yet beyond its legends lies something far more unsettling: evidence of engineering, astronomy and construction techniques that still raise difficult questions today. The first serious archaeological surveys around Beshbarmag began during the Soviet period in the 20th century. Early expeditions uncovered fragments of ceramic vessels, fire pits, ritual platforms, and traces of ancient stairways carved directly into the mountain. Later studies revealed that the site was not used during only one era. Layers of occupation suggested repeated activity from ancient Caucasian tribes, Persian influences, medieval pilgrims, and Silk Road travellers over many centuries. Each excavation added another piece to the mystery, but also exposed technological problems researchers still struggle to explain. One of the first puzzles involves the mountain itself. Beshbarmag stands approximately 382 metres above the surrounding plain, composed largely of sandstone and sedimentary rock vulnerable to erosion. Geological studies show the area experiences strong Caspian winds carrying salt particles capable of accelerating weathering. Under such conditions, exposed structures should deteriorate relatively quickly. Yet some carved steps, retaining walls, and ritual platforms have survived for centuries in surprisingly stable condition. Researchers examining the surviving masonry noticed unusual surface hardening on several stone sections. Similar effects have been documented at Petra in Jordan and parts of Machu Picchu in Peru, where mineral crystallization may have naturally reinforced exposed rock over time. However, some specialists suspect ancient builders at Beshbarmag intentionally selected rock layers with higher silica density or used mineral-based coatings now mostly lost to erosion. What makes this controversial is that no surviving written records describe such methods in the Caucasus during that period. Excavations also revealed narrow carved channels running across parts of the mountain slope. At first, they were dismissed as natural fractures. Later measurements showed several maintained nearly identical gradients over long distances, suggesting deliberate hydraulic engineering. The channels appear designed to guide small but continuous flows of water without causing overflow or erosion. Modern engineers note that maintaining stable gravity-fed water movement on steep stone surfaces requires surprisingly precise calculations. This becomes even stranger when considering the mountain's environment. The surrounding region receives relatively low annual rainfall compared to wetter mountain systems farther west in the Caucasus. Ancient builders somehow created a controlled water distribution network in an area where water itself was limited. Similar hydraulic sophistication appears at ancient Nabatean sites in Jordan, where engineers harvested seasonal rainfall with remarkable efficiency. Yet the civilization associated with Beshbarmag remains poorly understood and left behind no surviving technical documentation. Archaeologists later uncovered traces of pilgrimage shelters and ritual fire areas near the upper sections of the mountain. Carbon samples from some burned materials suggested repeated ritual activity across multiple centuries rather than one continuous settlement. This raised a major question. Why did so many cultures continue returning to the same isolated peak generation after generation? Part of the answer may lie in the mountain's strange geographic position. Beshbarmag stands near historic trade corridors connecting Persia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Caspian coast. From the upper slopes, visibility extends across vast sections of surrounding terrain. Some historians believe the site may have doubled as an observational signalling point for travelers moving along Silk Road routes. If true, the mountain was not only sacred but strategically important. But the greatest mystery surrounding Beshbarmag involves astronomy. Several Azerbaijani researchers studying the mountain noticed that sunlight behaves unusually around certain carved sections during seasonal transitions. Near the equinoxes and summer solstice, sunlight passes through natural rock gaps and illuminates specific ritual zones for only short periods. Measurements taken during field observations suggest some alignments are remarkably precise. Ancient cultures around the world often track solar movement, but the engineering implications here are difficult to ignore. To intentionally align ceremonial areas with seasonal solar angles, builders would need years, possibly generations, of astronomical observation. They would have to record how sunrise and sunset positions shifted across the horizon throughout the year, and then incorporate those measurements into the site's layout. This is where comparisons become unavoidable. At Chichen Itza, the famous shadow serpent effect appears during equinox sunsets because of carefully calculated architectural geometry. At Newgrange, winter solstice sunlight enters a narrow passage and illuminates the burial chamber for only minutes each year. Stonehenge aligns with solstice sunrise positions with extraordinary accuracy despite its age. Beshbarmag may represent a smaller and less famous example of the same phenomenon emerging independently in the Caucasus. Some researchers argue the alignments could simply be coincidence created by natural geology. Others disagree, pointing out that several pathways and ritual areas appear positioned specifically towards solar directions rather than random orientations. If intentional, the site suggests a surprisingly advanced understanding of cyclical astronomy among ancient peoples of the region. Adding to the mystery are the mountain's acoustic properties. Several caves near the shrine areas produce unusual sound reflections. Field tests demonstrated that voices spoken in certain chambers can travel farther than expected through connected rock corridors. Similar acoustic engineering has been documented in ancient ceremonial sites such as the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni, where specific frequencies resonate powerfully within underground chambers. Researchers at Beshbarmag still debate whether the sound effects were intentionally exploited for rituals or simply discovered accidentally by pilgrims over centuries. The mountain's role in local mythology further complicates interpretation. For generations, people believed Beshbarmag possessed spiritual energy capable of connecting humans with supernatural forces. Medieval travelers described it as a sacred mountain where prayers carried unusual power. Some stories claimed wandering mystics could predict events after meditating near the summit. While such legends cannot be scientifically verified, they may explain why the site remained active long after many nearby settlements disappeared. Modern satellite imaging and drone surveys have recently revealed additional terraces and carved pathways previously hidden by erosion and vegetation. Every new survey seems to expand the scale of the site rather than simplify it. Archaeologists increasingly suspect that much of the original complex may already have collapsed or remains buried beneath centuries of rockfall. What remains unanswered is how ancient builders working with limited tools managed to create stable structures, controlled water channels, astronomical alignments, and ritual pathways on such hostile terrain. Even today, constructing permanent infrastructure on steep eroding sandstone requires careful geological reinforcement and modern surveying equipment. Do you think the ancient builders of Beshbarmag Mountain truly understood advanced engineering and astronomy far beyond what historians expect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Near the western shores of Lake Turkana, in one of the harshest landscapes in East Africa, archaeologists uncovered something that should not have existed there at all. The site now known as Namora appeared at first to be little more than a cluster of dark volcanic stones rising from the dry ground. But as excavations began during the 1970s, researchers realized the stones were not random. They had been deliberately erected into a complex arrangement unlike anything previously discovered in sub-Saharan Africa. The first surveys identified approximately 19 basalt pillars standing upright around burial cairns and stone platforms. Early radiocarbon dating from charcoal and associated organic remains suggested the site was constructed between roughly 300 BCE and 300 CE. That immediately created a historical problem. At the time, many scholars believed societies around Lake Turkana were relatively small pastoral communities without large-scale engineering capabilities, yet each excavation season revealed something new. Archaeologists uncovered carefully arranged burials, ornamental beads, fragments of ceramics, and evidence of long-distance trade. Some glass beads were chemically linked to trade routes stretching toward the Nile Valley and the Indian Ocean coast. The implication was staggering. Communities living around Turkana may have been connected to regional exchange networks thousands of kilometers wide. During excavations in the 1980s, researchers Mark Lynch and L.H. Robbins noticed another anomaly. Several of the pillars appeared to align with the rising positions of important stars used in Cushitic calendrical systems. Suddenly, Namora transformed from an isolated burial site into a possible prehistoric observatory. That theory would ignite one of the most controversial debates in African archaeology. The first mystery surrounding Namora is brutally simple. How was it built at all? The Turkana Basin is one of the hottest and driest regions in Africa. Modern temperatures frequently exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Water is scarce, vegetation is limited. Even today, transporting heavy materials across the volcanic terrain is difficult without vehicles. Yet the builders of Namora somehow quarried, transported, positioned and stabilized nearly 20 basalt pillars weighing hundreds of kilograms each. Basalt is not an easy stone to manipulate. It is dense, extremely hard and fractures unpredictably. Unlike softer limestone used in many Egyptian monuments, basalt requires enormous effort to shape or extract using primitive tools. Some researchers estimate that several pillars may have been transported from distances exceeding several kilometers. Without wheels, cranes, or pack animals on an industrial scale, the logistical challenge becomes extraordinary. Even Stonehenge, often compared to Namora required immense communal coordination to move stones across southern Britain. But Stonehenge existed within a far wetter environment with greater timber availability and agricultural infrastructure. Namora was constructed in near-desert conditions. The mystery deepens when examining the stability of the pillars themselves. The ground around Lake Turkana experiences significant thermal expansion because of dramatic temperature fluctuations between day and night. Modern concrete structures in similar environments often crack after repeated heat stress cycles. Yet many of Namora basalt pillars remain standing for nearly 2,000 years. Geologists studying the stones propose that the builders may have intentionally selected basalt with unusually high density and thermal resistance. Some pillars also appear to have been partially buried below the surface to increase stability, a surprisingly advanced structural solution for what was once assumed to be a technologically simple culture. No one knows how these engineering decisions were discovered. The greatest mystery of Namora revolves around the sky. In 1980, Lynch and Robbins published research suggesting that at least 7 of the basalt pillars aligned with the rising positions of stars associated with an ancient Cushitic lunar calendar. These included Sirius, Aldebaran, Bellatrix, the Pleiades cluster, and Triangulum. If accurate, the implications are enormous. The Cushitic calendar system used calendar complex stellar observations to track seasonal cycles. In arid East Africa, predicting seasonal change could mean survival. The arrival of rains determined migration routes, grazing patterns, and food availability. A society capable of mapping recurring stellar positions with physical monuments would possess an extraordinary practical advantage. What shocked researchers was not merely the possibility of astronomical observation, but the apparent precision. Some alignments showed deviations of only a few degrees from calculated stellar rising positions for the proposed time period. Critics argued this could be statistical coincidence. However, supporters countered that the probability of multiple pillars accidentally corresponding to major calendrical stars was unusually low. The debate remains unresolved because Namorotunga lacks written records. Unlike ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, there are no inscriptions explaining the purpose of the site. Everything must be reconstructed from geometry, orientation, and archaeology alone. Still, the parallels with other ancient observatories are difficult to ignore. Stonehenge tracks solar movement through monumental stone alignments. Nabta Playa contains prehistoric stone circles linked to astronomical observation. Chankillo functioned as a solar calendar with 13 observation towers. These civilizations were separated by oceans and developed independently, yet all arrived at a remarkably similar concept: transforming the movement of the heavens into permanent architecture. That convergence raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps ancient societies around the world understood observational astronomy far earlier and far more accurately than modern historians once believed. Some anthropologists even argue that astronomy may have been among humanity's first true sciences. Long before writing, metallurgy, or states, people may have been systematically studying celestial cycles because survival depended on it. If that is true, then Namorotunga may preserve evidence of a forgotten scientific tradition emerging from the deserts of East Africa. Excavations beneath the stone complex revealed another layer of mystery. Archaeologists discovered burial chambers containing human remains alongside beads, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. The arrangement suggested the site held deep ritual significance. Some burials appeared carefully positioned relative to the standing stones, implying the astronomical alignments and funerary practices may have been connected. This mirrors patterns seen in numerous ancient civilizations, where celestial observation became intertwined with religion and death. In Egypt, tombs aligned with stars associated with the afterlife. In Mesoamerica, pyramids reflected solar cycles tied to divine kingship. Even at Stonehenge, cremated remains were buried near astronomical alignments. Namorotunga may represent an African expression of the same phenomenon, the merging of cosmology, timekeeping, and ritual burial into a single sacred landscape. But another anomaly complicated the picture. Chemical analysis of some artifacts suggested external influence or long-distance exchange. Certain beads resembled materials linked to broader East African trade systems. That means the people of Turkana were likely not isolated nomads, but participants in a network of communication extending across enormous distances. If knowledge traveled with trade, then astronomical ideas may have spread as well. This possibility radically changes older assumptions about technological development in ancient sub-Saharan Africa. What do you think Namorotunga truly was? A sacred burial ground or an ancient observatory built by a civilization far more advanced than we realize? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Northern Israel's Jezreel Valley holds one of the most mysterious archaeological sites ever discovered, Tel Megiddo. Early excavations began in the early 20th century under German archaeologist Gottlieb Schumacher, but later digs by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago revealed something extraordinary. Megiddo was built, destroyed, and rebuilt more than 20 times across nearly 5,000 years. each civilization constructed directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, creating an artificial mound nearly 60 feet high. Archaeologists uncovered layers dating from the early Bronze Age to the Assyrian Empire, turning Megiddo into one of the most complex archaeological timelines ever discovered in the ancient world. But the deeper researchers excavated, the stranger the site became. Megiddo was not simply a city. It appeared to be a military engineering hub operating at a technological level that many historians believe should not have existed in the ancient Levant during the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. Its scale, infrastructure, underground systems, and logistical organization continue to challenge modern understanding of early urban engineering. The greatest mystery beneath Megiddo lies underground. At some point around the 9th century BCE, engineers carved an enormous water access system directly through solid limestone bedrock. The project included a vertical shaft approximately 35 meters deep, connected to a tunnel more than 70 meters long leading toward a hidden spring outside the city walls. The purpose was revolutionary for its time. Instead of forcing citizens to leave the city during sieges to collect water, Megiddo's inhabitants created a concealed underground route, allowing secure access even while enemies surrounded the fortress. The engineering problem, however, is what confuses modern researchers. Ancient workers excavated downward through hard rock with primitive iron and bronze tools, then precisely redirected excavation horizontally underground with remarkably small navigational error. Without modern surveying equipment, lasers, explosives, ventilation systems, or electric lighting, the builders somehow maintained directional accuracy deep below the surface. Compared to other ancient water systems such as Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem or the Qanat systems of Persia, Megiddo's construction remains unusually ambitious for its period. Engineers estimate that removing thousands of tons of limestone manually would have required enormous labor coordination and long-term planning. Even today, recreating such excavation entirely by hand would be a major logistical operation. Megiddo controlled the Via Maris, the ancient trade route linking Egypt with Mesopotamia. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled one of the most important economic arteries in the ancient Near East. Because of this, the city evolved into a massive fortified military center. Its walls were multi-layered. Defensive sectors were arranged strategically. Storage facilities, administrative compounds, barracks, and gates were integrated into a sophisticated urban defense layout rarely seen in cities of comparable age. The most controversial structure is the famous six-chambered gate. Constructed from enormous stone blocks fitted with surprising precision, the gate forced invaders through narrow defensive corridors while exposing them to attack from multiple sides. Similar gate systems appear at Hazor and Giza, leading some archaeologists to argue they were part of a centralized construction program during the reign of King Solomon around the 10th century BCE. Others fiercely disagree. Carbon dating and ceramic analysis from later excavations suggest some structures may actually belong to the Omrida dynasty nearly a century later. This debate is critical because it changes the entire timeline of state formation in ancient Israel. If Megiddo's monumental structures truly date to Solomon's era, then the kingdom possessed engineering capabilities and centralized political organization far more advanced than previously believed. One of the most debated discoveries at Megiddo involves a series of long stone buildings traditionally interpreted as horse stables. The structures include rows of stone pillars, tethering holes, feeding troughs, drainage systems, and enough capacity to hold hundreds of horses. Some reconstructions estimate space for nearly 500 war horses. If correct, Megiddo may have functioned as one of the largest chariot war centers in the ancient Near East. This would place it alongside military powers such as Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire, all of which relied heavily on horse-drawn warfare. But the mystery remains unresolved. Some archaeologists argue these buildings were not stables at all. They may have been warehouses, military storage halls, or barracks repurposed later for animals. Others believe evidence for horse occupation is strong due to wear patterns, organic residues, and structural layout. The argument reveals something deeper about Megiddo. The city appears to have operated on a scale far beyond what many scholars once thought possible for Iron Age kingdoms in the Levant. Maintaining hundreds of horses would require massive grain production, water distribution, veterinary knowledge, stable management, and transportation networks. In practical terms, it implies an organized logistical machine approaching early imperial standards. Another unexplained aspect of Megiddo is the durability of its construction materials. Sections of walls, floors, and compacted surfaces survived thousands of years despite earthquakes, wars, erosion, and extreme temperature fluctuations. Some floor layers remain extraordinarily dense and resistant, even without modern cement technology. Researchers studying ancient Near Eastern construction discovered that many builders used carefully engineered mixtures of lime, ash, crushed stone, and compacted sediment to create durable surfaces with impressive load-bearing capacity. Yet certain material compositions at Megiddo still remain poorly understood. In some locations, mud brick structures survived far longer than expected in seasonal climates capable of rapidly destroying untreated earth architecture. Archaeologists suspect builders possessed sophisticated empirical knowledge of drainage, moisture control, and soil stabilization. The mystery resembles other ancient engineering puzzles such as Roman marine concrete, whose chemical self-strengthening reactions were only recently understood through microscopic analysis. Megiddo may represent another lost branch of ancient material science. Few cities in history experienced as much destruction as Megiddo. Egyptians, Canaanites, Israelites, Assyrians, and later empires fought repeatedly over the region. Archaeological layers show evidence of fires, collapses, warfare, and violent reconstruction cycles across centuries. Yet every time the city was destroyed, another civilization rebuilt directly on top of the ruins. This process required extraordinary labor organization. To reconstruct massive fortifications, underground systems, gates, storage complexes, and administrative centers repeatedly over centuries implies access to large workforces, quarrying operations, transportation infrastructure, and centralized planning authorities. Modern scholars often underestimate how difficult such rebuilding would have been without industrial machinery. Moving multi-ton stones manually, excavating defensive systems by hand, and supplying construction materials continuously would demand social coordination, approaching that of early states or proto-empires. Megiddo forces historians to reconsider how advanced Bronze and Iron Age administrative systems may actually have been. What makes Megiddo even more mysterious is that the site continuously changes historical interpretation itself. Every new excavation season produces discoveries that challenge earlier conclusions. Carbon dating results contradict old chronologies, pottery sequences shift timelines. Architectural phases are constantly reassessed. Few archaeological sites generate as much academic conflict. Some researchers see Megiddo as proof of a highly centralized biblical kingdom, with monumental architecture and advanced state engineering. Others argue the city's greater structures belong to later political powers, and that earlier kingdoms were smaller and less organized. In other words, Megiddo is not only a mystery of ancient engineering, it is a mystery about how modern civilization reconstructs the past itself. Do you think Tel Megiddo proves that ancient civilizations were far more advanced than we've been taught? Or are modern researchers still missing part of the bigger picture? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Bilsk Hill Fort lies across the forest steppe region of central Ukraine, near the Vorskla River, covering an area so vast that early researchers struggle to believe it was built during the Iron Age. The site first attracted scholarly attention in the 19th century, but large-scale archaeological investigations accelerated during the 20th century, when aerial surveys revealed enormous earthworks stretching across the landscape. What archaeologists initially believed were disconnected embankments turned out to be part of a massive fortified complex covering nearly 5,000 hectares. The outer defensive perimeter alone extends for more than 30 kilometers, making Bilsk one of the largest ancient fortified settlements ever discovered in Europe. Excavations conducted during different decades revealed increasingly disturbing contradictions to accepted history. Early digs uncovered Scythian ceramics, iron weapons, bronze ornaments, and traces of large wooden structures. Later excavations exposed workshops, storage pits, ritual areas, and evidence of organized urban planning. In the 1970s and 80s, archaeologists began finding imported Greek amphorian luxury goods originating from colonies along the Black Sea coast. By the early 21st century, LiDAR surveys and satellite imaging revealed that much of the site still remained buried beneath forests and agricultural land. Every new excavation seemed to expand the mystery instead of solving it. Some researchers believe Bilsk may be the lost city of Gelonus, described by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. According to his writings, Gelonus was an enormous wooden city inhabited by a mixture of Greeks and Scythians, surrounded by gigantic walls and filled with temples dedicated to Greek gods. For centuries, historians dismissed the description as exaggeration. But Bilsk changed that argument forever. The first mystery surrounding Bilsk is its sheer size. Even compared to famous Iron Age settlements in Europe, the site appears disproportionate to its era. The fortified oppidum of Heuneberg covered roughly 100 hectares. Major Celtic hill forts across Western Europe rarely exceeded several hundred hectares. Bilsk, by contrast, extends across nearly 50 square kilometers. To construct defensive walls on this scale required the movement of millions of cubic meters of earth. Some embankments rise more than 10 meters above the surrounding terrain when measured from the base of the defensive ditch. Archaeologists estimate that tens of thousands of workers would have been required to complete the fortifications within a realistic time frame. Yet mainstream history traditionally describes the Scythians as largely nomadic horse cultures with limited permanent urban infrastructure. That contradiction has never been fully resolved. The engineering itself creates even deeper questions. The walls were not random piles of soil. Excavations show layered construction methods designed to stabilize the embankments against erosion. Certain sections appear reinforced with timber frameworks, similar to techniques later seen in medieval fortifications. Defensive ditches were strategically placed to maximize visibility and create kill zones against attackers approaching from open steppe terrain. Some archaeologists argue that Bilsk functioned as a seasonal refuge rather than a permanent city. But this theory struggles to explain the enormous labor investment, the extensive internal zoning, and the evidence of long-term occupation. Others propose that Bilsk was the center of a regional political confederation capable of mobilizing massive labor forces across the steppe. If true, this would suggest a level of political organization among the Scythians far beyond traditional assumptions. One of the strangest aspects of Bilsk is that much of its architecture was made from wood, a material that normally disappears almost completely over time. Yet traces of large wooden structures continue to emerge beneath the soil. Herodotus described Gelonus as a city built almost entirely from timber, including temples and defensive towers. For centuries, historians doubted that a wooden city could survive long enough or grow large enough to rival stone-built Mediterranean centers. But excavations at Bilsk have uncovered post holes, burned timber remains, and construction patterns suggesting organized wooden architecture on an enormous scale. The problem is logistical. Maintaining a settlement of this size would have required extraordinary quantities of wood. Researchers estimate that large-scale deforestation must have occurred around the region during Bilsk's peak occupation between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE. Timber would have been needed not only for homes, but also for defensive walls, workshops, roads, gates, towers, and heating systems during brutal Eastern European winters. This raises another unanswered question. Where did the labor and resources come from? The surrounding environment could not easily sustain a gigantic urban population without advanced agricultural systems. Yet evidence suggests Bilsk supported thousands, possibly tens of thousands of inhabitants. Storage pits discovered across the settlement indicate large-scale grain collection and redistribution. Some pits contain traces of millet, barley and wheat, implying organized agricultural production rather than simple subsistence farming. In many ways, Bilsk resembles the logistical complexity of later urban civilizations more than the mobile tribal societies usually associated with the Scythian world. Another major mystery emerged when archaeologists began uncovering imported Greek goods throughout the settlement. Excavations revealed amphora fragments from Black Sea colonies, fine ceramics, jewelry, wine containers, and luxury items originating hundreds of kilometers away. This discovery shocked researchers because Bilsk lies deep inland, far from the Mediterranean world. The quantity of imported goods suggests regular trade rather than isolated exchange. Some scholars now believe Bilsk may have controlled a major trade corridor linking the Black Sea to the interior of Eurasia. If so, the city may have served as a gateway between Greek colonies and steppe populations extending towards Central Asia. The economic implications are enormous. Trade networks on this scale required security, administration, storage systems, and diplomatic coordination. In effect, Bilsk may have operated as a commercial hub comparable in regional importance to certain early urban centers in the ancient Near East. Some comparisons have even been made to the role played by Carthage in controlling Mediterranean exchange routes, although on a smaller scale. Yet there is still no consensus about who controlled the city. Was Bilsk ruled by the Scythian elites, a mixed Greek-Scythian population, merchants, clans, a military aristocracy? The archaeological record provides clues, but no definitive answer. Perhaps the most unsettling mystery involves the massive burn layers discovered across several parts of the settlement. Archaeologists identified evidence of intense fires that destroyed large sections of Bilsk during different occupation phases. Charred timber remains and ash deposits indicate catastrophic events rather than isolated accidents. Some areas show signs of rapid destruction, while others suggest gradual abandonment. The cause remains unknown. One theory suggests military invasion. Another proposes internal conflict between rival Scythian factions. Climate instability may also have contributed. Around the 4th century BCE, environmental changes across the Eurasian steppe may have disrupted trade routes and agricultural production, but none of these explanations fully account for the scale of decline. What makes the mystery even stranger is that Bilsk did not simply vanish overnight. Certain areas continued to be occupied after major destruction events, while others were abandoned permanently. It is almost as if the settlement fragmented over time instead of collapsing in a single catastrophe. This pattern resembles the slow disintegration seen in other ancient centers such as Cahokia or parts of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean world, where environmental stress, economic instability, and political fragmentation combined into long-term decline. Bilsk forces historians into an uncomfortable position. For generations, the Scythians were portrayed primarily as mounted nomads, highly mobile warrior societies without major urban traditions. Yet Bilsk contradicts that image almost completely. The site demonstrates advanced engineering, organized labor, economic specialization, regional trade integration, and large-scale defensive planning. Some scholars now argue that the Scythian world was far more diverse than previously believed, containing both nomadic and semi-urban populations operating within interconnected political systems. Others believe Bilsk represents a unique anomaly rather than a broader pattern. But the unanswered questions continue growing. Why build fortifications large enough to defend an entire city-state in a region supposedly dominated by mobile tribes? Why invest enormous resources into permanent infrastructure if the population remained largely nomadic? Why do historical records barely mention a settlement of this scale outside the writings of Herodotus? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many other massive ancient centres remain hidden beneath the forests and plains of Eastern Europe, still undiscovered because historians never expected them to exist there in the first place? The island of Latay Stone Quarries still holds massive stone pillars capable of surviving Pacific typhoons, earthquakes, humidity, and centuries of erosion. Some weigh more than 30 tons. No metal cranes, no wheels, no written engineering system. Yet the ancient Chamorro people built structures that modern researchers still struggle to fully explain. Archaeologists first began seriously documenting Guam's Latay stones during Spanish colonial surveys in the 17th and 18th centuries, but large-scale scientific excavation accelerated in the 1900s after American researchers mapped quarry sites hidden in forests and limestone hills. What shocked them was not just the size of the stones, but the precision of the engineering. Some unfinished pillars still remain attached to quarry bedrock, revealing evidence of systematic extraction methods rather than random carving. Latay stones are unlike almost any other megalithic structure on Earth. Each monument typically consists of two parts: a vertical limestone or basalt shaft called the haligi, and a rounded capstone known as the tarsa. Together, they formed elevated foundation for ancient Chamorro buildings between roughly 900 and 1700 CE. Some shafts exceed 4 meters in height and weigh between 10 and 30 tons. But the greatest mystery is not their size, it is their geometry. The rounded tarsa sections were shaped into near-symmetrical hemispheres with surprisingly balanced curvature. Modern measurements at several quarry sites show variations of only a few centimeters across large circular surfaces. That level of consistency is difficult even with metal tools. Yet the Chamorro people had no iron technology. Researchers comparing the quarry marks to Polynesian and Micronesian stoneworking traditions discovered something unusual. Most Pacific Island cultures using stone tools produced rough, fractured surfaces, but several Latay stones display long grinding marks and smooth finishing patterns, more comparable to advanced stone polishing techniques seen in parts of the Roman world or at certain Incan sites in Peru. Some archaeologists believe basalt hammerstones combined with coral sand abrasion may have slowly shaped the surfaces over months or years. Others suspect thermal cracking methods may have been used, heating stone with fire before rapid cooling to create controlled fractures. However, no consensus exists because no surviving tools perfectly match the quarry marks. Even stranger, several unfinished Latay stones suggest standardized proportions. The ratios between shaft diameter and capstone width appear repeated across multiple sites, implying the existence of engineering rules or inherited architectural templates. Transporting the stones may be even harder to explain than carving them. Guam's interior is filled with dense vegetation, steep volcanic terrain, and soft coastal soil. Yet Latay stones were often moved kilometers away from quarry sites and aligned in remarkably straight rows. Experimental archaeologists attempted to drag replica stones across tropical ground using rope and log systems. The results were disastrous. Heavy stones sank into wet soil, shifted unpredictably, or cracked under uneven stress. Unlike the Egyptians, the Chamorro had no evidence of wheeled transport draft animals or large-scale road systems. Yet dozens of massive stone structures were successfully relocated and erected. One theory suggests the builders used seasonal conditions strategically, transporting stones during periods when the ground was firmer after dry weather. Another proposes lubrication systems involving coconut oil, wet vegetation, or rolling palm trunks, but none fully explain how rounded tarsa capstones were stabilized during movement. A slight imbalance could have caused catastrophic rolling accidents. The engineering challenge becomes even more mysterious when compared to other ancient cultures. The average Easter Island moai weighs around 13 tons. Many latte components fall within similar weight ranges, yet Guam's humid terrain is far more unstable than the volcanic plains of Rapa Nui. This may be the most astonishing mystery of all. Guam sits in one of the most geologically violent regions of the Pacific. The island experiences earthquakes from nearby tectonic activity and is frequently struck by super typhoons with winds exceeding 250 kilometers per hour. Modern reinforced buildings have collapsed during some storms, yet many latte stones remained standing for centuries. Engineers studying the structures notice something unexpected. The design itself may function as a primitive shock distribution system. The rounded tarsa capstones potentially reduced horizontal stress by allowing subtle load redistribution during seismic movement. Instead of rigidly locking the upper structure in place, the curved geometry may have helped absorb vibrations and wind energy. Some structural analysts compare the concept to primitive base isolation principles used in modern earthquake-resistant architecture. In modern engineering, flexible support systems help buildings dissipate seismic forces rather than resisting them directly. Surprisingly, latte stones may have unintentionally achieved a similar effect through shape alone. The elevated design also protected wooden structures from flooding, insects, and ground moisture. Air circulation beneath houses reduced humidity damage in Guam's tropical climate. This means the system was not merely symbolic and clept, it solved multiple environmental problems simultaneously. Comparisons with other ancient civilizations make the achievement even more remarkable. Roman columns were highly stable but depended on rigid compression systems. Japanese pagodas survive earthquakes using central flexible columns called shinbashira. The latte stone system appears to represent a completely different engineering philosophy, developed independently in the Pacific. Some researchers argue the Chamorro may have accumulated centuries of observational knowledge about storm behavior and structural balance. Without mathematics or written physics, they may still have discovered empirical engineering principles through repeated experimentation across generations. No written records survive explaining how the system was designed. Yet the stones themselves continue to function like silent engineering prototypes, tested by nature for hundreds of years. At several quarry locations, archaeologists discovered partially detached stones still connected to bedrock. These unfinished pieces provide rare insight into the extraction process. What confuses researchers are the unusually straight grooves cut into limestone surfaces. Coral limestone is notoriously unpredictable when fractured manually. It tends to crumble irregularly rather than split cleanly. Yet some quarry channels appear surprisingly controlled. Microscopic analysis revealed repeated abrasion patterns that may indicate rotational grinding motions rather than simple hammer strikes. This suggests the possibility of sophisticated, repetitive carving techniques. Several surfaces also show polishing levels difficult to explain in a tropical outdoor environment. Wind erosion and salt exposure should have degraded the finish rapidly. Yet portions remain relatively smooth even after centuries. Some scientists compare the weather resistance of certain latte stones to Roman marine concrete, which also gained unusual durability from mineral interactions with salt water. Guam's limestone may have undergone natural chemical hardening over time due to oceanic exposure, though this theory remains debated. The tarsa capstones remain one of the greatest unanswered questions. If the purpose was purely structural, flat surfaces would have been easier to carve, easier to transport, and more stable. Instead, the Chamorro deliberately created rounded hemispheres requiring vastly greater labour. One practical explanation claims the shape prevented rats from climbing into elevated food storage houses. Similar anti-rodent architectural solutions exist in parts of Southeast Asia, but many researchers believe this alone cannot justify the extreme precision and enormous effort involved. Another theory proposes astronomical or ceremonial meaning. Certain latte alignments may correspond loosely with seasonal solar directions or prevailing wind patterns. Others suggest the rounded forms symbolized cosmological concepts connected to ancestry or navigation. The Chamorro were among the Pacific's most advanced navigators. European sailors in the 18th century were stunned by the speed and maneuverability of Chamorro flying proa vessels, some of which reportedly outperformed European ships under specific wind conditions. That raises an unsettling possibility. The same understanding of balance, weight distribution, aerodynamics, and environmental forces used to master long-distance ocean travel may also have influenced the engineering of latte stones. If true, these monuments were not primitive constructions at all, but products of a deeply specialized knowledge system now almost completely lost. What do you think the rounded Tasser capstones were really designed for? Simple protection, advanced engineering, or something far more mysterious? Share your theory in the comments below. Cold winds sweep across the Kashmir Valley, where an ancient settlement near Srinagar revealed one of the strangest archaeological discoveries in South Asia. Located about 16 kilometers northeast of the city at an elevation of roughly 1,800 meters above sea level, Burzahom was first identified during the 1930s and later excavated extensively by the Archaeological Survey of India between 1960 and 1971. Archaeologists initially believed the site was a small prehistoric village. But the deeper they excavated, the stranger the settlement became. Beneath the surface were deep underground pit houses, advanced bone tools, mysterious standing stones, and engineering techniques that seemed almost impossible for the Stone Age society living in one of the harshest climates of ancient India. The name Burzahom means place of birch in Kashmiri, yet beneath that quiet landscape, researchers uncovered evidence of a community that survived for nearly 2,000 years, from around 3000 BCE into the early Bronze Age. What shocked archaeologists was not simply the age of the settlement, it was the level of environmental adaptation and technical precision hidden within it. Because the deeper excavators went, the less Burzahom behaved like a normal Neolithic site. The most famous mystery of Burzahom is its underground dwellings. Large circular and oval pits were cut directly into the hard soil, some descending nearly 4 meters deep. Stair-like footholds were carved into the side so residents could climb in and out. Post holes indicated wooden roofing systems once covered the structures, turning them into semi-subterranean homes. At first glance, archaeologists assumed these pits were primitive shelters against winter cold, but later thermal studies suggested something much more sophisticated. Modern earth-sheltered architecture operates on a simple principle. Soil acts as a thermal buffer. At depths of several meters, underground temperatures remain relatively stable year-round. In Kashmir, where winter temperatures can drop below freezing and summer temperatures fluctuate dramatically, this design would have created a naturally insulated environment requiring far less fuel for heating. The problem is accuracy. The Burzahom pits were not randomly dug holes. Many displayed carefully angled walls, smooth-cut surfaces, and consistent structural depth. Some pits even appeared positioned to minimize water infiltration during snowmelt seasons. In modern engineering, underground structures require knowledge of drainage pressure, soil collapse risk, and thermal retention. Yet the people of Burzahom supposedly possessed only stone and bone tools. Even more puzzling is durability. Kashmir's soil undergoes seasonal freeze-thaw cycles capable of destabilizing modern foundations. Yet several pit structures survived recognizable for nearly 5,000 years. Archaeologists still debate how these deep excavations resisted collapse long enough for generations of habitation. Some researchers compare Burzahom's pit architecture to Neolithic settlements in Siberia and northern China. But Burzahom lies thousands of kilometers away from those regions, raising another unresolved question. Did similar survival technologies emerge independently? Or was ancient knowledge travelling across Eurasia far earlier than historians once believed? One of the greatest surprises at Burzahom was the enormous quantity of bone tools. Archaeologists uncovered harpoons, needles, arrowheads, awls, and spear points crafted from animal bones with astonishing symmetry. Bone is an extremely difficult material to shape precisely. Unlike stone, it fractures unpredictably under pressure. Producing thin, balanced tools without splitting the material requires careful control of force and angle. Yet many Burzahom artifacts show polished surfaces and near-identical dimensions. Microscopic analysis revealed evidence of repeated grinding and smoothing phases, suggesting a surprisingly advanced production process. Some needles were thin enough to imply the stitching of animal hides or woven materials. Others displayed drilled perforations with remarkably circular openings. This is where the mystery deepens. Creating consistent holes in bone without metal drill bits presents a major technical challenge. Experimental archaeologists attempted reproductions using stone points and abrasive sand mixtures. While possible, the process was painfully slow and difficult to standardize. Yet Burzahom produced these objects in significant quantities. The spearheads are equally mysterious. Several display aerodynamic forms similar to much later hunting technologies. Researchers studying impact fractures concluded that many were designed specifically for high-velocity penetration, rather than simple stabbing weapons. That implies deep empirical understanding of motion, balance, and material resistance, concepts normally associated with far more technologically developed societies. Compared to many contemporary Neolithic cultures in South Asia, Burzahom's bone industry appears unusually specialized. Some archaeologists even describe it as resembling Arctic survival technologies more than typical Indian Neolithic traditions. Among the most emotionally disturbing discoveries at Burzahom were burials containing both humans and animals. Dogs were found intentionally buried beside human bodies, sometimes in positions suggesting ritual placement rather than disposal. This has led some researchers to argue that Burzahom preserves some of the earliest evidence of emotional human-animal relationships in the Indian subcontinent. But the implications go beyond symbolism. If dogs were already domesticated companions here nearly 5,000 years ago, the residents likely relied on them for hunting, protection, or transport assistance in harsh terrain. The Kashmir Valley during the Neolithic period was heavily forested and populated by dangerous wildlife including wolves, bears, and large deer species. Faunal remains show that Burzahom hunters pursued an unusually wide range of animals. Hunting at this scale would have required organized cooperation, tracking systems, and seasonal planning. This was not a tiny, isolated tribe barely surviving winter. It was a stable society capable of long-term adaptation. Some anthropologists believe the complexity of these burial rituals hints at early spiritual systems tied to animals and celestial cycles. Others argue it reflects social stratification already emerging during the Neolithic era. Either way, Burzahom forces archaeologists to reconsider how socially advanced early mountain communities may have been. Perhaps the most controversial artifact from Burzahom is a carved stone slab depicting a hunting scene beneath two circular objects in the sky. Some scholars interpret the image as symbolic or mythological. Others believe it may represent an actual atmospheric or astronomical phenomenon. One theory suggests the carving depicts a sundog, an optical illusion caused by ice crystals refracting sunlight in extremely cold environments. Sundogs can create the appearance of multiple suns in the sky and are still observed in polar and high-altitude regions today. If correct, this would mean the people of Burzahom carefully observed and recorded rare atmospheric events thousands of years ago. What makes the carving remarkable is its detail. The positioning of hunters, animals, and celestial objects appears deliberate, rather than abstract. Compared to many contemporary rock art traditions, the composition is unusually structured. There is another unsettling possibility. Some researchers argue the dual celestial symbols may indicate early cosmological beliefs connected to seasonal survival. In extreme climates, understanding solar movement would have been critical for predicting migration patterns, snow conditions, and planting cycles. If Burzahom's residents tracked the sky systematically, they may have possessed a practical observational astronomy long before formal astronomical traditions emerged in ancient India. In later occupational phases, Burzahom's residents erected large standing stones around the settlement. These megaliths are not as massive as those at Stonehenge or the Moai statues of Rapa Nui, but their existence in Kashmir creates major engineering questions. Some stones weighed several hundred kilograms. Transporting them across uneven ground without wheels, metal tools, or draft animals would have required coordinated labor and surprisingly advanced mechanical understanding. The soil conditions of the Kashmir Valley make the challenge even greater. Wet ground and seasonal freezing reduce stability, making upright placement difficult. Yet several stones remained standing for millennia. Researchers still debate whether these megaliths served ritual, astronomical, or territorial purposes. Their exact alignment patterns remain poorly understood due to erosion and incomplete preservation. But their presence proves one thing clearly. Burzahom evolved far beyond a simple pit-dwelling village. What do you think Burzahom really represents? A surprisingly advanced Stone Age society, or evidence that ancient human knowledge was far more sophisticated than history admits? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On the edge of ancient Athens, inside Elefsina, thousands of people entered a dark stone hall for nearly 2,000 years and emerged believing they had witnessed the gods themselves. No one fully explained what happened inside, and whatever the priests were doing was so powerful that even Roman emperors crossed the Mediterranean to experience it. The ruins of Elefsina were systematically excavated during the 19th and early 20th centuries by Greek archaeologists, including Dimitrios Philios and later researchers from the Archaeological Society of Athens. Beneath layers of Roman and Byzantine remains, they uncovered the telesterion, one of the strangest ceremonial structures ever built in the ancient world. For centuries, the Eleusinian mysteries were considered the most sacred initiation ritual in Greece. Philosophers such as Plato, Cicero, and Sophocles described the ceremonies with unusual reverence, and Cicero even claimed the rites transformed humanity from a savage existence into civilization itself. Yet almost nobody described the actual ritual. Participants swore absolute secrecy under penalty of death, and unlike Egyptian tomb inscriptions or Mesopotamian ritual tablets, Elefsina left behind almost no direct explanation of what initiates witnessed inside the sanctuary. This absence of information became one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Tens of thousands of people attended these ceremonies across nearly 2 millennia, but the secret survived longer than entire empires. Modern historians believe the experience was designed to psychologically overwhelm participants through a combination of architecture, darkness, fasting, sound manipulation, ritual movement, and possibly psychoactive chemistry. One theory centers around a sacred drink called kykeon. Ancient texts mention it repeatedly but never explain its composition in detail. In 1978, ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson proposed that kykeon may have contained ergot fungus, a naturally occurring mold growing on grain that contains alkaloids chemically related to LSD. The theory remains controversial but scientifically plausible. Ergot compounds can alter perception, intensify sound sensitivity, distort time perception, and trigger profound emotional experiences. However, ergot is also extremely dangerous. Incorrect dosage can cause seizures, gangrene, hallucinations, or death, and medieval outbreaks of ergot poisoning killed thousands across Europe. That creates a disturbing possibility. If the priests of Elefsina truly used ergot-based compounds safely for centuries, then they may have possessed an unexpectedly advanced empirical understanding of neurochemistry long before modern science existed. The greatest mystery of Elefsina was not the ritual itself, but the building designed to control human perception. At the center of the sanctuary stood the telesterion, a massive enclosed initiation hall, unlike almost any traditional Greek temple. Most Greek temples emphasized exterior beauty and open-air visibility, but the telesterion did the opposite. It was designed to trap people inside darkness. The structure evolved across centuries and eventually reached approximately 50 meters on each side. Estimates suggest it could hold between 3,000 and 5,000 initiates simultaneously, an enormous number for the ancient world. Stone seating surrounded the interior in stepped formations, focusing attention toward a central sacred chamber called the anaktoron. What shocked modern researchers was the building's acoustic behavior. Unlike theaters designed for clarity across open spaces, the telesterion appears optimized for resonance, echo layering, and directional confusion. Some acoustic engineers studying ancient ritual architecture believe the enclosed stone geometry could amplify low-frequency sounds and create disorienting reverberations. In complete darkness, the human brain struggles to locate sound direction accurately. Low-frequency resonance between roughly 30 and 80 Hz can also trigger physical sensations in the chest, anxiety responses, and altered emotional states. Modern psychoacoustic studies show prolonged exposure to certain frequencies can increase suggestibility and emotional intensity. The telesterion may have exploited exactly those effects. Bronze instruments, chanting, synchronized footsteps, hidden chambers, and reverberating stone surfaces could have produced an experience far beyond ordinary religious ceremonies. Ancient initiates repeatedly described terror, awe, blinding light, and the sensation of crossing into another reality. Some researchers compare the telesterion to other ancient structures associated with altered states of consciousness. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni hypogeum contains chambers resonating around 110 Hz, a frequency shown in modern studies to affect brain activity and vocal perception. The ceremonial galleries of Chavin de Huantar used underground stone corridors and water acoustics to psychologically overwhelm pilgrims. But Elefsina may have achieved something even more advanced. Its architecture was repeatedly rebuilt after destruction, invasions, and earthquakes, yet the core acoustic geometry remained preserved. That strongly suggests the sound behavior of the building was intentional, rather than accidental. The telesterion was not merely a temple, it may have been one of humanity's earliest engineered psychological environments. Ancient descriptions repeatedly mention sudden flashes of light appearing during the climax of the ritual. In total darkness, even a weak light source becomes neurologically overwhelming, but witnesses implied something far more dramatic occurred inside the telesterion. The Greek word epopteia referred to the final revelation, the moment initiates saw the sacred truth. Nobody knows how the priest created this effect. Some historians suspect polished bronze mirrors may have reflected concentrated firelight through hidden openings, while others believe mineral compounds such as gypsum, calcite, or phosphorescent substances could have amplified luminous effects inside the sealed chamber. Even more intriguing is the role of sensory deprivation. Modern neuroscience shows that extended darkness, fasting, emotional stress, repetitive chanting, and sleep deprivation can significantly alter brain chemistry. Dopamine and serotonin responses become unstable, hallucinations become more likely, and emotional memory becomes intensified. Military interrogation studies, isolation experiments, and sensory deprivation research all demonstrate how rapidly human perception changes under controlled environmental stress. The priests of Elefsina may have discovered those effects experimentally thousands of years ago. The experience began long before initiates entered the Telesterion. Participants travelled roughly 21 kilometres from Athens to Elefsina along the Sacred Way, a ritual road crossing bridges, cemeteries, wells, and symbolic landmarks tied to death and rebirth mythology. The procession lasted for hours. Initiates fasted, endured physical exhaustion, and participated in synchronized chanting before entering the sanctuary. Modern psychologists would recognize this immediately. Physical stress increases emotional receptivity and group conformity. The combination resembles techniques later used in military conditioning, initiation systems, and intense religious experiences worldwide. Researchers comparing ancient rituals across civilizations note striking parallels with Mesoamerican pilgrimage systems, Egyptian temple processions, and even modern crowd psychology experiments. Elefsina appears to have weaponized anticipation itself. By the time initiates finally entered the Dark Hall, their brains may already have been neurologically primed for transcendence. Another mystery lies beneath the visible ruins. Greece is one of the most earthquake-prone regions in Europe. Yet portions of the Telesterion's foundations survived repeated seismic events for centuries. Archaeological surveys show tightly interlocked stone blocks, layered foundation systems, and load distribution methods unusually sophisticated for their time. Some stone joints fit with millimeter-level precision. The sanctuary underwent multiple reconstructions from the Archaic period through Roman rule, but builders consistently preserved the ritual core and structural alignment. This indicates long-term architectural planning rather than random rebuilding. Engineers have compared aspects of Greek anti-seismic methods with Incan stonework at Machu Picchu, where flexible interlocking blocks absorb earthquake vibrations without collapsing. At Elefsina, stability was not just practical. Protecting the ritual chamber itself may have been considered sacred. What do you think truly happened inside the Telesterion? Was it ancient psychology, forgotten technology, or something humanity still doesn't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Shunet el-Zabib stands in the desert plain of Abydos in southern Egypt, roughly 500 kilometers south of Cairo. Archaeologists believe it was built around 2700 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khasikhemwy, the last ruler of Egypt's second dynasty. The structure was first seriously documented in the 19th century, but only modern excavations revealed how enormous and technologically advanced it truly was. Hidden beneath drifting sand were walls still standing more than 11 meters high, despite being built mostly from mud brick over 5,000 years ago. What researchers uncovered was not simply another ruined enclosure. It appeared to be a missing evolutionary step between the earliest royal tomb complexes and the later Pyramid Age that transformed Egypt forever. The greatest mystery surrounding Shunet el-Zabib is its survival. The enclosure measures roughly 137 meters long and 77 meters wide, with walls nearly 5 meters thick in some areas. It was constructed from an estimated several million mud bricks. Under normal environmental conditions, sun-dried mud brick architecture deteriorates rapidly. Rain, salt crystallization, thermal expansion, and desert wind erosion slowly reduce ancient mud brick cities to flattened mounds within centuries. Yet Shunet el-Zebib still stands after more than 50 centuries. Researchers studying the surviving bricks discovered unusually dense manufacturing methods. Many bricks contain finely chopped straw fibers distributed with remarkable consistency, reducing shrinkage cracks during drying. Some analyses also suggest the presence of mineral-rich clay mixtures with high silica content that increased durability. The wall cores were packed extremely tightly, while outer layers appear engineered to absorb stress and prevent catastrophic cracking. What makes this extraordinary is the timeline. Comparable large-scale earthen engineering projects with similar durability would not appear until much later civilizations. In Peru, advanced adobe compounds emerged thousands of years afterward. Roman concrete, famous for its longevity, would not appear for another 2 millennia. Modern compressed earth architecture uses stabilization chemistry and engineering models unavailable to ancient Egypt. Yet somehow, builders at Shunet el-Zebib achieved structural endurance rivaling many later stone monuments. Even more mysterious is the wall design itself. The outer facade contains deep recessed niches repeating across the enclosure. Egyptologists once believed these were decorative imitations of palace architecture, but some engineers argue the recessed geometry may also have distributed thermal stress across the wall surface. By interrupting flat expansion zones, the structure may have reduced long fracture lines caused by desert temperature shifts that can exceed 30 degrees Celsius between day and night. If true, this would represent a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of structural behavior for one of the world's earliest royal monuments. The scale of organization behind Shunet el-Zebib raises another major mystery. Egypt at the time was still emerging from its early unification period. Large centralized bureaucracies were only beginning to form. Yet constructing this enclosure required labor coordination on a level previously considered impossible for the era. Millions of bricks had to be produced with relatively standardized dimensions. Clay had to be extracted, transported, mixed with water and organic material, molded, dried, and stacked in precise sequences. Massive quantities of water were necessary despite the surrounding desert environment. Workers needed food supply systems, transportation networks, and construction supervision. Archaeologists estimate that large sections of the enclosure may have required thousands of laborers operating in organized teams. This resembles the logistical systems later associated with the Old Kingdom pyramid builders centuries afterward. The mystery becomes even deeper when comparing Shunet el-Zebib to the step pyramid complex of Djoser at Saqqara. Many architectural concepts appear strikingly similar despite the chronological gap. Some researchers believe the enclosure represents an experimental phase in royal monument construction, essentially a prototype for the Pyramid Age itself. Without sites like Shunet el-Zebib, Egypt may never have developed the engineering confidence required to attempt massive stone pyramids. One reason Shunet el-Zebib fascinates archaeologists is because it appears technologically transitional. Earlier royal tombs in Egypt were relatively modest mastabas, while later monuments became gigantic stone complexes dominated by pyramids. Shunet el-Zebib sits directly between those worlds. The enclosure already demonstrates monumental scale, symbolic royal architecture, ritual spatial planning, controlled ceremonial access, and massive perimeter construction. These are exactly the principles later perfected at Saqqara and Giza. Many Egyptologists believe the famous architect Imhotep may have inherited concepts originally developed at Abydos. The enclosure walls at Shunet el-Zebib strongly resemble the niche facades later reproduced in stone around Djoser's step pyramid complex. Even the idea of a sacred royal enclosure separated from the outside world appears nearly identical. This raises a profound historical question. Were Egypt's greatest architectural breakthroughs invented gradually through experimental mud brick engineering long before the first pyramid stones were placed? If so, Shunet el-Zabib may represent the lost laboratory where pyramid architecture was born. Despite decades of excavation, scholars still debate the actual purpose of the structure. It is commonly described as a funerary enclosure associated with Khasek Himwi's tomb at el-Ka'ab nearby. However, the scale seems disproportionate compared to its understood function. Unlike pyramids, the enclosure contains no massive central burial chamber. Its interior space appears unusually open. Evidence suggests ceremonies occurred there, but exactly what kind remains unclear. Some theories suggest the enclosure hosted royal renewal rituals similar to the Sed festival, a ceremony connected to kingship and divine authority. Others argue it symbolized a palace for the afterlife, allowing the deceased ruler's spirit to continue existing ceremonially after death. A more controversial interpretation proposes that the complex functioned partly as a cosmic symbolic structure aligned with religious geography. Abydos itself was one of the holiest locations in ancient Egypt long before Giza became dominant. The region later became associated with Osiris, god of the dead. Some researchers suspect the enclosure's placement within the sacred landscape carried astronomical or theological significance still poorly understood today. The lack of definitive inscriptions only deepens the mystery. For such a colossal royal project, Shunet el-Zabib remains strangely silent. Near the enclosure, archaeologists discovered several buried wooden boats dating to the same general period. Some exceeded 20 meters in length. These vessels are among the oldest large-scale ritual boats ever found in Egypt. Their existence creates another technological puzzle. Egypt lacked abundant large timber resources. Constructing boats of this scale required advanced woodworking, long-distance material acquisition, and sophisticated hull design. Cedar wood may have been imported from the Levant hundreds of kilometers away, implying extensive trade networks already existed during Egypt's early dynastic age. Boat construction also required understanding load distribution, joint reinforcement, waterproofing, and river navigation mechanics. This challenges older assumptions that advanced Egyptian engineering suddenly appeared during the Pyramid Age. Instead, Shunet el-Zabib suggests technological complexity had already been developing for generations. Some archaeologists believe these boats symbolize the king's journey through the afterlife. Others think they may have been functional ceremonial vessels used on the Nile before burial. Either way, they reveal a civilization already capable of coordinating surprisingly advanced maritime engineering over 4,700 years ago. Perhaps the strangest aspect of Shunet el-Zabib is that many of its features imitate later stone architecture, even though the structure itself was made from mud brick. The recessed facade design, monumental symmetry, enclosed ceremonial courts, and massive perimeter walls all resemble concepts later executed in limestone during the Third Dynasty. In some ways, the builders appear to have imagined monumental stone architecture before Egypt possessed the full technological ability to construct it on a national scale. This reverses the normal pattern seen in architectural history. Usually material capability comes first, followed by stylistic evolution. At Shunet el-Zabib, the symbolic architectural vision may have emerged before the engineering infrastructure fully existed to realize it. That possibility changes how historians view early Egypt entirely. Instead of a sudden pyramid revolution, Egypt's greatest monuments may have evolved through centuries of experimentation hidden inside structures like this one.